So we need to continue our exploration of special duty topics in the law of negligence. We know that there's a generic and basic duty standard, the plain vanilla, reasonably prudent person. But we also know that in a large number of cases, the reasonably prudent person standard will not control. We saw that with respect to children, and we saw that with respect to professionals. The next topic I want to take up with you is a fairly big topic, and that is usually called premises liability cases. Premises, like a piece of property, P-R-E-M-I-S-E-S, premises liability. The premises liability cases all involve the same basic fact pattern. Someone enters a piece of property, and while they are on that piece of property, they encounter a dangerous condition. And the question is always going to be, what duty of care does the person in possession of the property owe to the entrant on that property? The very first thing I want to tell you is just in the nature of an exam piece of advice. The range of fact patterns that they can write on premises liability questions is enormous because the types of property that we have and use in our society are enormous. The piece of property in question can be a piece of outdoor open land. For instance, it could be a tract of land in a forest that is being held for future development. It could be a field or orchard owned by a farmer. It could be a vacant lot in a city. It could be some outdoor developed parcel, such as an amusement park. And then, of course, it could be a building. It could be an apartment building or an office building. It could be a commercial establishment like a supermarket. It could be a private home. The range of hazards that someone might encounter when they enter a piece of property is also enormous. Really, almost anything that could hurt you. It might be a chair in your doctor's waiting room that is very flimsy and will collapse when you sit on it. It might be the chandelier in your friend's dining room, not securely bolted to the ceiling, that could fall on your head in the middle of a dinner party. It could be the icy front steps of your friend's house when you leave the dinner party after the evening is concluded. So you have to be relatively alert and you have to be relatively flexible in thinking about which kinds of problems fall within this category. Now, the reason this is a big subject is not because the law is complicated. It's just because there's a lot of subparts. And the reason for that is because in assigning duties of care, what the legal system has chosen to do is to make the duty vary depending on the kind of entrant we are dealing with. Entrants on land, entrants on property are divided into 4 categories. Each type of entrant is entitled to a different standard of care. So what I want to do is I want to take you through these 4 categories. I want to expand on the duties of care, and then we're going to have some follow-up footnotes that I will take up with you at the end of this topic. First kind of entrant that you may see on the exam is an unknown trespasser. An unknown trespasser. This is a self-evident category, it seems to me, but just to be 100% absolutely clear. This person comes on the land without permission, and possessor does not know he is there. An unknown trespasser. An unknown trespasser is owed 0 duty of care. Absolutely none whatsoever. And because an unknown trespasser gets no care at all, an unknown trespasser always loses a negligence claim in a premises liability context. You can't win unless you can establish a duty. No duty is owed, you're going to lose. Undiscovered trespasser, out of luck, very simple rule. But before I leave it alone, I do want to say one further thing. I want to tie it up with something that we did earlier because I think it'll reinforce your understanding of the material. Why is an undiscovered trespasser treated so harshly? Well, part of the reason is, of course, that we don't have particular sympathy for folks that come on property without permission. But there's a further reason. It's analytically consistent because an undiscovered trespasser is essentially Mrs. Palsgraf. Remember, the Palsgraf rule is all about people who are unforeseeable victims. When someone comes on your land without permission and you have no knowledge that they are there, they literally are the most perfect example of an unforeseeable victim. And so in that scenario, it's not surprising that we have a zero duty of care. Let's move ahead. Second kind of entrant that you may see on a premises liability question will be a known trespasser. A known trespasser. This category is, however, somewhat broader than the title implies. Known trespasser category also includes what I'm going to call anticipated trespassers. Anticipated trespassers are those who you should expect to trespass, even if you don't have actual and concrete awareness that they are on the property. Now, here's a hint. It may not work 100% of the time, but it'll work 90% of the time. They are signaling anticipated trespassers when they tell you that there has been a pattern of trespassing in the past. If people have frequently come on your land without permission in the past, there's a good chance they will continue to do so in the future. Consequently, you should expect them. We will treat them as anticipated. If people frequently take a shortcut through your backyard on a particular Tuesday morning, you might not be aware that there is a trespasser in your backyard, but you should expect that there could be one. They're anticipated. Now, the duty standard for this category, the known or anticipated trespasser category, is that the possessor must protect only against those hazards on the land that meet a four-part test. That's a bit annoying. It means more to memorize. I apologize for that. It is what it is. But at the end of the four-part test, what I'm going to try to do is give you a compressed formula that I think will be easier to hold in your head. All right? So let me do it the right way. First, we're going to walk through the four parts, make sure we get them. Part number one, first element of the test. The condition in question must be artificial in order to trigger a duty. Artificial means constructed by human beings. The opposite of an artificial condition is a natural condition, a condition that occurs naturally on the property through the forces of Mother Nature. And it follows that a possessor owes a known or anticipated trespasser no duty, zero, with respect to naturally occurring conditions. You know that someone is trespassing on your land. You know that there's an accumulation of snow or ice somewhere on your property and they could slip and fall and break an arm. You owe them no duty because accumulation of snow or ice is naturally occurring. Condition must be artificial to trigger a duty. Part two of the four-part test. The condition must be highly dangerous. Highly dangerous means, well, it means what it sounds like. Capable of inflicting severe bodily injury or death. You owe no duty with respect to only moderately dangerous conditions. You have an area rug in your property. You have not put a pad underneath the area rug. It tends to slip and slide a little bit when people walk on it. You could, if you are careless, in walking on that rug, twist your ankle. There's a trespasser on your property. You know that they are there. Do you owe them a duty to protect them from that slippery rug and the potential twisted ankle? You do not, because that is not a seriously dangerous or highly dangerous condition. Third element of this four-part test, the condition must be concealed from the trespasser. The trespasser must have no advanced knowledge. It has to be a hidden condition. The opposite of this one would be an open and obvious condition. And you owe no duty of care with respect to an open or obvious condition. The theory is that the trespasser can see it, and the trespasser can take whatever precautions he or she might wish to take, but it's not your problem. It's got to be concealed. And then fourth and finally, you, the defendant, the possessor of the property, must have prior knowledge that the condition exists. You must have prior knowledge that the condition exists. If you don't know about it, you owe no duty. Now, I said I would try to compress that. It's 4 words. You could just memorize 4 words or 5 words. Artificial, highly dangerous, concealed, known to the possessor. But I think we can do better. What I like to say is that in this category of premises liability, the possessor owes the known or anticipated trespasser only a duty to protect from the known man-made death traps on the land. You look at the condition and you ask if it's a known man-made death trap. If the answer is yes, that will trigger a duty. If the answer is no, there will be no duty. Now, this is a very narrow duty. It's not a zero duty, but it's a very minimal duty, right? Think about it in a mathematical way. I want you to imagine you possess a piece of land, and I want you to imagine that if you had perfect information, you would be aware of 100 hazards on your land. How many of them will meet this 4-part test? Chances are only 2 or 3. Some of the hazards on your land will be natural, and you will owe no duty with respect to those. Other hazards on your land will be open and obvious. You'll owe no duty as to those. Other hazards may be only moderately dangerous. You don't owe duty as to those. And other hazards you may be yourself unaware of. So you would only owe a duty to protect from 2 or 3 out of 100 potential hazards on your land. If that trespasser got hurt by any of the 97 other hazards, that trespasser would be out of luck. It's a narrow duty because we don't particularly like trespassers. That takes us to the third type of entrant on land. The third type of entrant on land is a licensee. Licensees enter land with permission. That can be express or implied. They enter land with either express or implied consent, but they do not confer any economic benefit on the possessor of the property. They do not enrich the possessor economically. The most common type of licensee is a social guest. A friend you invite over to dinner, somebody you say, come to my Super Bowl party, an out-of-town guest who's sleeping on your sofa bed. Other types of licensees are folks who come to your door, usually unbidden, unsolicited. The politician who's seeking your vote and wants to speak with you for a moment. The Girl Scout selling Girl Scout cookies. The religious zealot seeking to convert you on your doorstep. Okay? These people are all licensees. They don't confer economic benefit, but they're entering with either an express or an implied permission. Here, your duty is defined by a 2-part test. For these folks, you only have to protect against those conditions which, number 1, are concealed from them, and number 2, are known in advance by you. Concealed from them, known in advance by you. Obviously, these are elements 3 and 4 from the previous test. We have eliminated a requirement of artificiality with respect to licensees. With respect to licensees, you must protect them from both artificial and naturally occurring hazards. We've eliminated the requirement that the hazard be significantly or seriously dangerous. You must protect them even from moderately or slightly dangerous hazards. You owe that duty of care. And so we can compress this one into another short phrase. We might as well be parallel. The short phrase here is that you must protect licensees from all known traps on your land. The word traps signals that they are hidden to the licensee, but they're known to you. So you protect them from all known traps on the land. Let me go back to my mathematical model and make the obvious Conclusion. If there are a theoretical 100 hazards on your land, now perhaps you will owe a duty to protect against 40 of them or 50 of them, because now we have brought back in a large number of hazards that were excluded from the previous category, namely the naturally occurring ones and the moderately dangerous ones. So the duty is a bigger and more expansive duty. It's exactly what you would expect as a matter of common sense. Of course, we expect you to exert more effort to protect the safety of people who enter with permission than to protect the safety of trespassers. Now we come to the fourth and final category. That would be the invitees. Invitees enter with permission, and they enter to confer economic benefit on the possessor. They enter to confer an economic benefit on the possessor. Now, in the modern view, you're also an invitee if you enter property that is open to everyone. Not open selectively, but is open to the general public. The stereotypical or classic example of an invitee is a business customer. You're an invitee when you go shopping at the supermarket. You're an invitee when you go to the barber shop to get your hair cut or the hair salon to get your hair styled. But you're also an invitee if you go to the airport to pick up a friend from out of town, even though you do not do any commerce. You drive in, you pick them up, you drive away. You do not enrich the airport because the airport is open to the public at large. You're an invitee if you enter a museum that is open to the public and does not charge any admission. You're an invitee if you enter a house of worship, such as a church, a mosque, a synagogue, to admire the architecture or to worship. So what is the duty here? Yeah, it's another two-part test. The duty arises only when the condition, number one, is concealed from the invitee. Concealed from the invitee. And number two, the condition must be one which is either known by the possessor or could be discovered through a reasonable inspection. Known or could be discovered through a reasonable inspection. So the first thing I want to ask rhetorically is, what do we mean by a reasonable inspection? Well, a reasonable inspection is the inspection that would be conducted by a reasonably prudent person. It is not a superhuman inspection. The reasonably prudent person is thorough, but is not insane. The reasonably prudent person takes cost into account. So a reasonable inspection is reasonably thorough, and it occurs at reasonable intervals. It does not necessarily require inspecting the property every day or every hour. It does not require tearing up the floorboards looking for hidden problems. Can this one be reduced to a short formula? Yeah. I would say that you owe an invitee a duty to protect from all reasonably knowable traps. All reasonably knowable traps. And mathematically, we are now up to maybe 80 out of 100 hazards on the property that you would owe a duty. There are still going to be some hazards that you could not discover through a reasonable inspection. They're going to be so well hidden that you couldn't find them. And as to those, you would owe no duty. But as to all the other hazards, you would indeed owe a duty. Now, if you may be curious, so if you are wondering, is there a situation where you would have to protect against 100 out of 100 hazards? The answer is only if you're an insurance company. Protecting 100 out of 100 hazards is strict liability. You're strictly liable. You would be an insurer of the safety of the visitor, and the law of negligence does not do that. There's never a situation where you have to protect against all the hazards. If there are some that are undiscoverable through a reasonable inspection, you have no responsibility. Okay? So that's what we have, and it obviously suggests your methodology when you tackle these questions. First, you look at the question and you go, aha, it's a premises liability question. I see that somebody came on land. Next thing you do is you say to yourself, what kind of entrant am I dealing with? Then you retrieve from your memory bank the 4-part test, the 2-part test, as it may be, or the short phrase if you prefer, and you apply it to the hazard that hurt the plaintiff, and that will give you your answer. So with that methodology, let me give you a practice question. We're going to do what we've been doing all along. It's what I call my 1-sentence micro essay. So I want you to listen, then I want you to write down the answer. You have to write it down, okay? Can't just think it in your head. This is like learning a language. You ever buy the language tapes? You listen to the language tapes in the car and they say something in French and they say, repeat, and you're like, yeah, I'm not going to do that. Well, if you don't do that, you don't learn the language. So you got to write it down, all right? Here's my hypothetical. Daryl owns a large ranch, and on his ranch, there's a deep canyon over which there is a wooden footbridge. He recently had this footbridge inspected by an engineer, and the engineer told him that the bridge, although appearing perfectly safe to the naked eye, had rotted and can no longer support the weight of a human being. Literally, if you walk on the bridge, it will collapse, according to the safety inspector, and the safety inspector tells Daryl these facts. In any event, one day Daryl is out horseback riding on his ranch property, as he likes to do, and he sees Pete, a hiker who is on his land without permission, and Pete is headed directly for this wooden footbridge over the canyon. Does Daryl owe Pete a duty of care to take some measure to protect Pete from the bridge or not? Is there a duty or not? If you say yes, why? If you say no, why not? I say there's a duty. I think if you said duty, that's the better answer. That's the best answer. This is a situation where we're dealing with what kind of an entrant? A known trespasser. Obviously, Pete, the hiker, did not enter with permission, but Daryl has firsthand awareness of his presence. He saw him as he was horseback riding. The duty that you owe a known trespasser is to protect from known man-made death traps on the land. An artificial condition, highly dangerous, concealed from the entrant, but known to you. The bridge was artificial. It was man-made. It was built by humans. It's highly dangerous because if you walk on it, it collapses and you plunge to the bottom of the canyon. Death or serious injury will result. The hazard is concealed from the trespasser because the trespasser would look at it and to the naked eye, the bridge appears normal, but the hazard was known to Daryl. That's why the facts included the conversation with the inspector. That bridge was literally a known man-made death trap. And you know, the hypo illustrates why we have the duty in that limited case. Because ordinarily we might let the trespasser fend for himself. But if you know that this person is walking to a situation which is either certain death or certain serious injury, basic human decency requires you to lift up your finger and do something. You shouldn't just sit passively by as he walks towards the bridge thinking, this'll be amusing. That's not right, okay? Now, I said that once we finish the standards of care, there are a few additional matters we must cover. I'm going to characterize these as footnotes. I want to give you 3 footnotes in the premises liability scenario. Footnote number 1. Footnote number 1 involves firefighters and police officers. Firefighters and police officers frequently come on land. It's in the nature of their job. It's what they do. They enter property. But they are never allowed to recover for injuries that are inherent risks of their job. No recovery for any injury that is an inherent risk of the job. Let me focus on firefighters. It's an easier example, but it works the same for cops. What are the inherent risks of firefighting? Well, obviously, getting burned, smoke inhalation, getting hit by falling pieces of masonry or drywall or timber as you enter that burning building. If that happens, the firefighter is out of luck. You don't bother to categorize him as what kind of entrant. You don't bother to go through a 4-part test, a 2-part test, just out of luck. A lot of times when I cover this rule, I don't spend a lot of time on it when I'm teaching the course at GW, but with my first years, sometimes they are disturbed by this rule. They come to office hours and they're like, well, I don't understand why we're so mean to firefighters. Why we should be nice to firefighters. They're first responders and they're brave, they're heroic. Make hot calendars. Why are we being mean to them? And the answer is simple. It's a theory of assumption of the risk. The notion is that these people know what they're getting into. It cannot be a surprise to them when they enter a burning building that they might get burned. It cannot be a surprise to them when they enter a smoky building that they might suffer smoke inhalation. Indeed, they wear protective equipment to try to protect against that. But that is a simple rule. We've seen occasionally a single multiple choice question. If you see a firefighter or a police officer and it's an inherent risk of their job, they're going to lose. Now, understand it might not be an inherent risk of the job, right? Maybe the firefighter comes in to settle a domestic dispute and somebody in the home says, well, why don't you have a seat and we'll talk about it? And they sit on a chair and it collapses. That's probably not an inherent risk of policing, right? So it's got to be something that's linked up with the work. Footnote number 2, trespassing kids. Kids have a way of wandering where they will without regard to property lines, and kids trespass. And when they do, they sometimes get hurt. The law is obviously a little bit more generous to trespassing kids. So here's your rule. A property owner must exercise reasonable, prudent care to prevent injuries to trespassing children from artificial conditions on the land. Reasonable prudence to trespassing children with regard to artificial conditions on the land. Now, that as an abstract statement may not give you enough information to answer questions. Let me unpack it a teeny bit more. I want you to assume you own a piece of land. I want you to assume that you are a reasonably prudent person. And I want you to assume, which is almost certainly true, that you don't want to be liable to trespassing children. So you know, having just heard me say it, that you must exercise reasonable care. What is the first thing you're going to do? The first thing I'm going to do is assess the likelihood that children will come on my land. I'm going to try to make an estimate in my brain of how likely child trespassing would be. If my land is located literally in the middle of nowhere, rural Nebraska, nearest neighbor 10 miles away, that's probably an exaggeration, but nearest neighbor 10 miles away, the odds of trespassing children are virtually zero. Therefore, what does that mean? It means it would be reasonable to leave hazards lying all over the land. I could leave sharp pointed sticks in trenches all over my property, and it would still be reasonable vis-a-vis child trespassers, because there will be no child trespassers. On the other hand, if I live across the street from a middle school and I have a swing set visible in my backyard, I would assess the likelihood of child trespassing as very high. Now, in that last example, part of the reason that I assessed the risk of child trespassing as very high is because I was near a middle school. But that other fact was crucial. I said there was a swing set in my backyard. The swing set acts as a child magnet. In assessing the likelihood of trespassing children, I will ask myself, is there something on my land that will draw children in? Is there an item visible from off the property that acts essentially as a kid magnet, calling to the children of the neighborhood, come here, come play with me. Because once I know that there is an item like that on my land, reasonable prudence now dictates that I should make some effort to make the property safe. Now that I've thought it through, and I know that there's something that will draw the kids in, perhaps I should take away from the swing set those coils of barbed wire and those vats of sulfuric acid that I put underneath the swings, because maybe that's not so prudent. So all of this is by way of explaining something that you may dimly remember from your first year torts course, or may have stumbled across in doing research on a project. The logic that I just gave you is why this doctrine is known in negligence law as the attractive nuisance doctrine. Now, I hate that name because we have a tort called nuisance, and this has nothing to do with that. It is potentially misleading, but it's an old name, and it's been in the law for many, many decades. The idea is there's something on your land that pulls the children in, and as a reasonable person, now you should make your land safe. Final footnote I want to give you. If we have a duty that is owed in any scenario other than trespassing children, if we have a duty that is owed to an adult, a trespassing adult or a licensee or an invitee, if we have a duty that is owed, there are two ways that you can satisfy your duty. The first is to fix the hazardous condition, to eliminate the danger, to repair or make safe. To repair or make safe. If you've got snow or ice on your front steps, go out and chip it up. Or if not that, put down some sawdust or some rock salt in order to protect your guests from slipping on the snow. If you've got a rickety chair, get a wrench out, tighten the bolts, or throw out that chair. If you've got a rotten wooden footbridge, maybe you should get somebody in there and repair the bridge. But there's a second way that you can satisfy your duty. And the second way you can satisfy your duty is to give a warning. Rather than dealing with the item itself, you can simply provide information. You can basically give either an oral warning or you can use a sign. You just say to your guest, don't sit on that chair, it's kind of flimsy. You say to your guests as they're leaving, be careful on the front steps, they're icy. You put up a sign, do not cross this bridge, and you put a chain across the bridge. That satisfies your duty. Theoretically, analytically, it satisfies your duty because it converts a hidden danger into an open and obvious danger. Once you give the warning, if it is an effective warning, then the entrant now knows about the hazard and can take precautions. And you already know this, right? You already know this because, let me ask you a question, a rhetorical question. I don't want you to answer out loud, but here's a rhetorical question. What is the most common concealed hazard on land that we all encounter routinely? I would say a couple of times a week, at least. All right, you think of something? I'll tell you what I think it is. It's a wet floor. You go into a building after there's been rain. Maybe you go into the lobby of an office building after there's been rain. People have tracked water, moisture, into the lobby, and the floor is wet. The floor is a hard marble floor, though, and it looks shiny, wet, or dry. So you don't know that it is wet. It's concealed. But if you slip and fall, you'll break your arm. You go into a lavatory, a bathroom, they've mopped up. They do periodic cleaning in a public lavatory, at an airport, at a sports stadium. You don't know that it's wet because the tile is normally reflective, wet, or dry. Same problem. How do they deal with that from a legal liability point of view? Do they send people in to make the floor dry? Do they have a team of janitors who come in with towels? Not that I've ever seen. What they do is they give a warning. How do they give a warning? They use one of those rigid A-shaped signs. You've seen them a million times. They're ubiquitous, right? Those signs are there because their lawyers told them to put them up. They're fantastic. You ever look at them with the eyes of a lawyer? Probably not. I do, because I'm weird. Oh, they're fantastic. Think about them. First of all, they're exactly the height that is calculated to come into your range of vision as you're walking, right? When you walk, you're not looking out at the horizon, but you're not looking at your toes. You're looking kind of at a middle distance down, and they're perfectly height to see them in time to take preventative action, to be careful, right? And what color are they? They're that bright iridescent yellow. They're not beige. They want to make sure you see them. And what do they say? Well, they say warning wet floor. Couldn't be more obvious. That's not all they say. Because the people who make the signs and the lawyers who tell them to get the signs, they understand that our population is essentially bilingual. So the signs almost always say, warning, wet floor, aviso, piso mojado. Okay? Warning, wet floor, aviso, piso mojado, which I take it is warning, wet floor in Spanish. I don't actually speak Spanish, but I've learned by long exposure to the signs that means warning, wet floor in Spanish, right? These signs are like my personal Rosetta Stone, all right? It's the only Spanish I know. I go on vacation to Mexico. The people are very charming. They're like, hola, buenos dias. I say aviso, piso mojado. They think it's pretty weird, but that's all I know. Actually, some of them don't say aviso. Some of the signs say cuidado, piso mojado. And some of them say precaución, piso mojado. So Spanish is a beautiful language because there are 3 ways to warn you about a wet floor, all right? You go to the airport, they have special airport ones. They have like 6 languages in a circle. It's like warning, wet floor, aviso, piso mojado, Achtung, gefloren, gewetten, or what, I don't know, whatever it would be in German. And then it has a couple of Asian languages. And what is smack in the middle of the whole darn thing? The international icon for warning wet floor, the fall on your ass guy, right? That guy who's falling backwards. That's there for the illiterate people, okay? So you know this. Warnings satisfy the duty. And you know what? If as you get deeper into your bar prep, you get a little bit depressed, you get a little bit stressed out, it may happen. I hope it won't, but it may. And you're going to be out and about, you're going to see one of those signs. I want you to smile. I want you to smile when you see that sign. I want you to say, warnings, satisfied duties in premises liability. At least I'm getting that question right, okay? So that's a little sort of psychological tool that you can use. Enough said about premises liability. Big subject. Let's move on to another special duty scenario. Number 4, if you're keeping count, statutory standards of care. Plaintiffs generally do not like the reasonably prudent person standard. And the reason they don't like the reasonably prudent person standard is that the reasonably prudent person standard, stated in full, is a reasonably prudent person under the circumstances. And the words under the circumstances allow a defendant to always try to explain and excuse conduct by offering up information about surrounding circumstances. And plaintiffs hate that. Let's say you're a pedestrian and you got hit by a car. Car ran the red light. You were in the crosswalk. You had the green. You think you have the world's easiest negligence case. You're going to win this. But the defendant comes to court and he says, now, wait a second. I was being reasonable even though I ran a red light. Well, let me tell you why. My wife was in the back seat of the car and she was in labor. She was about to give birth. I had called 911, but nobody showed up. I had to get her to the hospital. So I slowed the car down to 20 miles an hour, but I wasn't going to come to a full stop and wait for the light to change. She would have given birth in the car. So I was reasonable under the circumstances. And now it goes to the jury and they have to sit there and rub their chin and be like, well, I think maybe he was reasonable under the circumstances. Plaintiffs hate that. Plaintiffs would much prefer a cut and dried rule. Plaintiffs would much prefer a rule that said, if you run the red light, you have to pay me. End of story, not interested in your excuses. And there is a branch of law that works exactly that way for the most part, and that's the criminal law. The criminal law says you're guilty if you do the elements of the crime, and we don't care about the larger surrounding circumstances. You rob a loaf of bread from a bakery, it doesn't matter if your family is starving. It's the plot of Les Mis, all right? And so the criminal law does embrace this idea of cut and dried rules. So, in the law of negligence, plaintiffs will often search for a criminal statute that covers the conduct that the defendant engaged in and ask the judge to use that statute as a one-time, this case only standard of care, shutting down and eliminating the possibility of excuses. In my example, there is, of course, a criminal statute that says you're not supposed to run a red light. You may not think of it as a criminal statute, but it's a criminal statute. You're subject to a fine. You don't go to jail, but you're subject to a fine. You get points on your license. What the plaintiff wants to do is to ask the judge to take the criminal command, stop at a red light, and turn that into duty. And then give the jury what I call an if must instruction. 2 words hyphenated, if must. If you find he ran the red light, you must find that he was negligent. If must. The question that you need to be able to answer on the exam is, when are you allowed to do that as a plaintiff? When may you borrow a criminal statute, even though technically it shouldn't be relevant in civil litigation? When may you borrow it and use it as the one-time only standard of care? The answer is a classic 2-part analysis. First, you must determine if the statute is designed to protect a class of people to which this plaintiff belongs. It's designed to protect a class of people that plaintiff is a member of. Plaintiff is a member of the class that the statute is seeking to protect. Second, you must demonstrate that the statute is designed to prevent the type of risk that actually materialized in this case. The injury which occurred is the kind of injury that this statute was trying to prevent. I usually refer to this as the class of person, class of injury test. Class of person, class of risk test. It's only 6 words, boils it down. If you can convince me that the test is satisfied, you are entitled to borrow the statute. Then, if you can prove a statutory violation, that statutory violation is conclusive evidence of a breach, no excuses allowed. And you will remember the name for this. This is usually called negligence per se. Negligence per se. Now, there is a body of law, a body of criminal law, where the 2-part test is almost always satisfied and where courts routinely borrow criminal statutes. That would be the traffic code. The traffic code, the vehicular code, the motor vehicle code, whatever it is called in your state of choice, that code is highly particularized. It's filled with minute little rules. You had to learn them all when you got your driver's license. And they contain things like you got to stop at a red light, you have to signal before making a turn, you can't cross a double yellow line, you have to yield before entering a traffic circle, and on and on and on. Almost every one of those is designed to protect the exact same class of people, namely pedestrians and other motorists. And it's designed to protect those people from the exact same risk, automobile accidents. So when somebody gets hit by a car and they can point to a traffic violation, it's usually the case that we will borrow it and it becomes the standard of care. It's kind of a slam dunk on this 2-part class of person, class of risk test. Unfortunately, you know what that means. The one kind of statute you're least likely to see on the exam is a traffic statute. It would be too easy. They tend to give you other statutes. So here's an example. Let's take time out to do another micro essay. All right? Here's my situation. I have this woman, again, a D name. She'll become a defendant. Her name is Dolores. Dolores goes to work one morning, unaware that there is a slow but significant gas leak coming from her stove. This is the natural gas that would normally be ignited to cook with. In any event, she comes home that evening after a very stressful day at work. She is completely stressed out. There were multiple meetings, all of which were very, very argumentative. And she's just like, I am just so stressed. I just can't stand this. I need to chill. And she thinks to herself, I've been trying to give it up. I've been trying to at least cut back. But no, the only thing that's going to chill me out after the day I had today, I need to smoke some marijuana. So she has a little box on a little table next to her favorite chair where she's seated. She goes in her box to get her marijuana accoutrements, okay? She digs around and she finds her rolling papers and she takes those out. She gets her little zigzags or bamboos, and then she digs around again. She gets that little black and gray Kodak film canister, the plastic one that she's lovingly saved ever since they did away with actual film in which she keeps her weed. She takes off the lid. She makes herself a nice little doobie, rolls it up, digs around a little bit more, finds herself a book of matches, strikes a match, and there's an explosion because of the gas leak that was coming from the stove all day. This gas leak, this explosion, blows out the wall of the apartment and damages the neighbor's furniture. I'll call the neighbor Patricia. Patricia sues Dolores for negligence and wants to recover the value of the furniture. In that lawsuit, Patricia cites a statute that in this jurisdiction says it remains a crime to use marijuana. Class A misdemeanor for under an ounce, you get punished by 3 months incarceration. Now, obviously, Patricia is not interested in sending Dolores to jail. She wants to know whether or not she can use the statute as the standard of care. Can Patricia use this statute, the marijuana statute, as the standard of care on these facts? Yes or no, why or why not? Patricia is not going to be able to use this statute. This statute fails both prongs of the two-part test. You can't borrow a statute unless you can establish class of person, class of risk. All right? What risk is the statute that criminalizes marijuana possession designed to protect against? What risk? Well, it's a good question, isn't it? People have had trouble figuring it out. That's why marijuana is being decriminalized across the country. It's very difficult to know what risk marijuana statutes were designed to prevent against. Perhaps they were designed to protect against health risks. Maybe if you smoke marijuana, you get lung cancer, just like with tobacco. Or maybe marijuana statutes were designed to prevent against the risk that you would then move on to harder and more serious drugs. Or maybe they were designed to prevent against mental health risks. Some people claim that if you smoke marijuana, you'll get clinically depressed over the long term. The one thing I am pretty sure about is that marijuana laws were not designed to prevent you from blowing up your apartment. Nobody who advocated the adoption of these laws when they were first put in place said, we got to stop these people from smoking marijuana. They're blowing up their apartments right and left. What about class of persons? The marijuana statute is clearly designed to protect the marijuana user from her own decision to use the drug. It is not designed to protect next-door neighbors. This one fails both halves of the two-part test. So if you said we do not borrow the statute, very good, you've got the concept. Now, the hypo and the answer do raise a further question. So what happens to this plaintiff who tried to borrow a statute, but then could not satisfy the two-part test? And the short answer is nothing happens to this plaintiff. Plaintiff goes merrily ahead under the plain, ordinary, reasonably prudent person standard of care. It's not like you suffer any penalty. You just go ahead and continue to litigate under the plain, vanilla, reasonably prudent person standard of care. On the facts of the hypo, If this were an essay question, a full-fledged MEE essay question, and you analyzed the statute and concluded that it did not apply, you would then go into the reasonably prudent person analysis. And on that analysis, what would you say? I'll tell you what I would say. I would say that this is a very strong case for the plaintiff. What does the reasonably prudent person do when returning to an apartment where gas has been leaking for 8 or 10 hours? Presumably they walk in and they go, oh dear, I smell gas. I must summon the fire department and warn the neighbors at once. You know, they're reasonable, right? I'll tell you one thing a reasonably prudent person doesn't do. They don't sit there and go, I smell gas. I think I'll light a match and investigate. Not bright. So, this is a very good case for the plaintiff, but under the reasonably prudent person standard of care. Let me close the topic with exceptions. Remember, duty rules tend to have exceptions. Peanut butter and jelly, bacon and eggs. Here are some exceptions. Number 1, even when the two-part test is met, if statutory compliance would have been more dangerous than statutory violation, don't borrow the statute. Compliance would have been more dangerous than violation. Remember, make this your own. Compliance, obedience, conformity to the statute, following statute would have been more dangerous. Let me give you a quick example of this and show you why it works the way it does. Dave, my defendant, is driving down a 2-lane highway on a curvy country road with a double yellow line. That means no passing. Don't go into the other lane because you can't see around the curve. At some point, as Dave comes around a curve, a child darts in front of his vehicle. In order to avoid hitting the child, he swerves to his left over the double yellow line. Just at that moment, Pete, another motorist, comes around the curve in the other direction in his car. Pete, seeing Dave in his lane, swerves off the road and hits a tree. Pete is badly hurt. Pete sues Dave. Pete, the injured motorist, sues Dave. And Pete wants to borrow the statute that says, do not cross a double yellow line. Class of person, class of risk is clearly satisfied here. It's a traffic ordinance designed to protect oncoming motorists from head-on collisions. That's why we have the double yellow line rule. It serves a purpose. But we will not borrow it because on these facts, had Dave obeyed the statute, he would have hit the child who ran in front of his vehicle. He violated the statute in order to mitigate or avoid a much more serious harm. This one will be analyzed under reasonable prudence under the circumstances. You need to know whether or not, for instance, he was driving at a safe rate of speed or was he driving too fast. You need to know whether or not he could have done something else in the spur of the moment that would have been safer. Maybe he could have swerved to the right onto the shoulder instead of to the left onto the incoming traffic lane. Let me give you the second and final exception here. If statutory compliance, if statutory obedience was impossible, don't use the statute even when the two-part test is met. Statutory compliance impossible. The iconic example is motorist has a heart attack, runs red light, hits pedestrian. Motorist runs red light, obviously we're going to try to use a red light statute, class of person, class of risk, world's easiest case. But if you have a heart attack and can't control your vehicle, statutory compliance is impossible. You can't stop the car because you're incapacitated. Here again, we fall back on a reasonably prudent person standard of care. I would want to know whether or not this guy had chest pains prior to the actual moment of the heart attack. Because if you're having chest pains and you're a reasonably prudent person, what do? You probably pull over to the side of the road. Dial 911 on your cell phone. Is this person supposed to be taking heart medication and did he skip his pill that morning? That would also be an example of an unreasonable thing to do. But the violation of the statute will not become the standard of care. So that takes me now to topic number 5 out of 6 special standards in the law of negligence, and that will be duties to act affirmatively. Duties to act affirmatively. This is, in a sense, I guess, our easiest special duty topic. The short and simple doctrinal piece of information here: there are no duties to act affirmatively. None. Zero. Period. Full stop. No duty to act affirmatively. But stated nakedly, it could mislead you. You might say to me, now, wait a second. If I'm driving my car and the light turns red, are you saying that I don't have to affirmatively lift my foot off the gas pedal and affirmatively press down on the brake? And the answer is, well, I'm not saying that. Of course you have to affirmatively lift your foot off the gas pedal and press on the brake. When I say you have no duty to act affirmatively, what I mean is you have no duty to undertake a course of action. That example of the gas pedal and the brake is a little bit too micro. When you drive your car, you have to drive as a reasonably prudent person, including taking affirmative steps to drive as a reasonably prudent person. But in the first instance, you don't have to drive a car. Nobody will make you drive a car. There's nothing in the law of negligence that penalizes you if you just want to take the bus or ride your bike or walk. That's up to you. You never have to undertake a course of activity. You don't want to go skiing? Don't go skiing. No one can make you go skiing. Once you decide to ski, you have to ski like a reasonably prudent person. You don't want to open a restaurant? That's fine. Who's going to make you open up a restaurant? You don't have to open a restaurant. But if you choose to open a restaurant, then you have to run the restaurant like a reasonably prudent person. You have to follow safe food handling protocols so as not to make your customers sick. You have to clean up spills so that your customers don't fall and hurt themselves. So when I say no duty to act affirmatively, I mean no duty to undertake a course of conduct. As far as we're concerned, you can sit at home all day and do nothing. Or as your mom, or as you probably said to your mom when you were in high school, it's a free country, right? And so you could do what you want. Now, when you study this in law school, there is a good chance that you don't study it in the form I just gave it to you. That's kind of implicit. You study one narrow application, but it is very famous and it is guaranteed to be on the exam. And that narrow application is that because you don't have to act affirmatively, you do not have to rescue a person in peril. The no duty to rescue rule is an application of the broader no duty to act rule. Now, the no duty to rescue rule probably should go in the category of too easy to test. Everybody knows it, a widely known rule, and not at all complicated, no subparts, kind of too easy to test. But the examiners feel obligated to test on it. It's so famous. So they have only one course of action in order to try to get a curve. What they will do is they will try to write a question that appeals to your emotions. They will try to write a question in which the defendants have been so despicable, so absolutely cold-hearted and heinous, that a small number of people will go, oh, well, that makes me feel sad, and will pick an answer that gives plaintiff relief. And that gives them just enough of a curve to justify asking the question. Now, I'll give you an example of the kind of question they like to ask. One day, Michael Phelps and Ryan Lochte and Missy Franklin, the three gold medal winning American swimmers from the past couple of Olympic Games, are walking down the street together. They're buddies, and they're walking down the street together, dressed in their Speedo bathing suits, wearing all their Olympic gold medals, okay? Because this is how they go out for a walk. And they come to a park, and they decide to take a shortcut through the park. When they get midway through the park, they come to a lake. It's quite a large lake. It's a large park. It's a beautiful park, big lake, and they hear a noise. And they look in the direction of the noise, and you know what they see? There's a little child, a little girl. She appears to be about 7 years of age, in the deepest part of the lake, water over her head. She's flailing about desperately. She's drowning. She's screaming out in terror, help me, save me, rescue me. And the question goes on to tell you that this little girl, she's the most beautiful child ever to have graced planet Earth. Oh my God, she's got brightly colored ribbons in her hair and a cute little button nose and a radiant smile. She's wearing her first communion dress. She fell in on her way back from church. And she's screaming, help me, save me, rescue me. And then she recognizes the athletes from their many TV appearances, and she says, Michael, Ryan, Missy, save me, please. I love you. So Michael looks at the other two and he says, what do you think? Should we go in after her? We could probably get there with 4 or 5 of those freestyle things we do. And the other two look at their Rolex watches and they say, no way, dude. We'll be late for signing our multi-million-dollar endorsement contracts. And so the 3 of them turn and walk away, exit stage left to the sound of flip-flops. They tell you at the end of the question, the only thing visible, a little bit of hair floating on the surface of the water. You finish that, by the time you finish that, you're sobbing uncontrollably. You're sitting in the bar exam room, pounding your desk. You're like, God damn bastards. They're not liable. They're just not liable, okay? This is just my riff on something you learn in law professor boot camp. No duty to rescue. Olympic swimmer does not have to save drowning baby, okay? The restatement of torts has a shorter, less elaborate example, but it's almost more horrible. I got to tell you the restatement example. It's just fantastic. Pedestrian's walking down the street. He's really the only one around. He comes to a corner and he sees a blind man about to step into traffic. He could avoid the blind man suffering injury by tapping him on the shoulder. Don't go now. There's cars. Hey, Mr. Blind Man, don't go now. He has no duty to do that. He can just stand there and be like, this will be amusing, okay? That's ridiculous. I mean, that's horrible, but that's the law. That's the law. There's no duty to rescue. And you can see with examples like that why some people get them wrong. Now, there are exceptions. There are 2 scenarios where there is a duty to rescue. Number 1, if there is a pre-existing relationship between plaintiff and defendant, that triggers a duty. The pre-existing relationship that triggers a duty is normally a legal relationship. I did air quotes if you're not looking at me, if you're looking away. What I mean by a legal relationship is a relationship on which we can actually put legal labels, like employer, employee, or landowner, invitee. Very popular on the exam, innkeeper and guest, common carrier, passenger. I go out of town on a business trip. I'm in a hotel. The hotel catches fire. It's an emergency. I'm in peril. The hotel owes me a duty. Why? Because we're not strangers to each other. We're in a pre-existing relationship. Second exception, if the defendant is the one who caused the peril, if the defendant put the plaintiff in peril, that also triggers a duty. The plaintiff caused the peril. Now, in both of these cases, I have tried to choose my words carefully. I have used the phrase triggers a duty, but you notice I didn't say a duty to rescue. The duty that is triggered in these 2 exceptions is a duty to act reasonably under the circumstances. You are never obligated to put your own life in jeopardy, and rescue may not be feasible under the circumstances. If I'm in a hotel and the hotel catches fire, the hotel owes me a duty. That does not mean that they must send an employee through the flames to fetch me and carry me down the stairs to safety. But they have to do something. Something may mean they have to call the fire department. Something may mean that if their sprinklers are not automatic, they have to activate them. Something may mean that they have to call me up on the hotel telephone system and give me instructions. Stay calm, help is on the way, put wet towels by your door, stay low to the ground. They have to do what is reasonable, but you never have to put your own life in jeopardy. If you owe a duty to rescue a drowning baby, but you yourself do not know how to swim, then you don't really owe a duty to rescue. You owe a duty to act. And what you need to do is take out your phone and call someone who can help. You can't just walk away, but the duty is a duty to act reasonably under the circumstances. Now, there's one last aspect of this problem that I do want to take up with you guys, and it is, what about people who are good and decent and who rescue even though they have no legal obligation to do so? These are people who take as their guiding text a book of greater significance than the Restatement of Torts. Okay? These people look to a greater book. And they decide to be gratuitous helpers in an emergency, but they screw up. The basic common law principle is if you opt to rescue and you perform the rescue negligently, you are liable. This is a general application of the basic rule. You don't have to act, but when you choose to act, you must act carefully. Don't want to drive a car? Don't. But if you drive, you better drive carefully. Don't want to rescue? Don't. But if you rescue, you better rescue carefully. Now, that rule of liability for gratuitous rescuers who mess up, for gratuitous rescuers who commit negligent acts, is a deterrent to voluntary rescue. So many states have changed that rule by statute. Many states have changed that rule by statute, and those statutes collectively are known as Good Samaritan laws. But on the UBE, unless they tell you there's a Good Samaritan law, which I don't think they will, the common law rule is the gratuitous rescuer is liable if the gratuitous rescuer performs the rescue carelessly. Okay? So, that concludes that topic. It leaves us with one last special standard of care. But what I would like to do for those who are with me here in the room is to go ahead and take a pause for the benefit of those folks. Stretch your legs, take 10, and we will come back and talk about the other elements of negligence.
This marks the beginning of a 10-minute break. The 10-minute break is ending.
So we come now to the very last of the special duty situations, and that is cases involving negligent infliction of emotional distress. You might wonder why I'm categorizing this as a duty problem at all. You might think to yourself, well, it sounds like a kind of a new tort or something. The reason I categorize it as a duty problem is because what we're really talking about is when do you have a duty to take precautions to avoid disturbing someone else's mental tranquility. We have been considering all along when you must take precautions to avoid physically harming them. But now the question turns to what are the cases where you must take care to avoid disturbing their mind. Now, in all negligent infliction of emotional distress cases, what you're going to have is you're going to have a negligent defendant who has violated one of the standards we've already covered. The very first part of the analysis is to establish negligence under one of the other standards, either the plain vanilla standard of the reasonably prudent person, or alternatively, one of the 5 special standards that we've already considered in depth. If you don't have that, end of story, there can be no liability for negligent infliction of emotional distress. If you do have a negligent person, but the plaintiff did not sustain any direct physical injuries, no physical trauma, the plaintiff is complaining only of mental disturbance, now the plaintiff will have to prove some additional facts. In addition to the simple negligence of the defendant, there are plus factors. And the plus factors will depend on what kind of case we're dealing with, because the courts have essentially divided negligent infliction of emotional distress cases into 3 subcategories. The first subcategory I want to tell you about are what I like to call the near miss cases. You can also call these the close call cases, if you prefer. Remember, synonyms are good. In these cases, I have a negligent defendant who did not hurt the plaintiff, but almost did. It was a matter of inches. It was a near miss. It was a close call. The classic fact pattern is you're crossing the street and a car runs a red light. The car doesn't hit you, but you're very emotionally upset because you were in the intersection at the time. Here are your 2 requirements in order to recover in a near miss case. Number 1, the plaintiff must show that he was in a zone of physical danger. Zone of physical danger. The phrase will be familiar, of course, because that's Cardozo's phrase from the Palsgraf opinion. You have to be reasonably close in. Frankly, this is just another way of reiterating the category title. If the category title is near miss, the first requirement is that it's got to be a near miss. It's got to be a close call. If you are crossing the street and the car runs the red light and almost hits you but misses you by a foot, you're in the zone of physical danger. You've established this element. On the other hand, if the car runs the red light and you are just stepping off the curb and the car is 50 or 40 feet away from you, you're not really in the zone of danger. You probably won't have a right of recovery. Second thing you have to show in these kinds of cases, you've got to show that as a result of the emotional distress, you then suffered subsequent physical manifestations. Subsequent physical manifestations. Now, subsequent means after. After can mean 1 second after. It can be almost instantaneous. The car sails through the intersection through the red light, misses you by 1 foot. You're like, oh my God, and then you clutch your chest and you fall to the ground with a heart attack. The heart attack, that is a subsequent physical manifestation. The physical manifestation might not show up for several hours. It might not show up for a day or 2. But what we are looking for is something that can be objectively measured and that will give us comfort that you're not lying about the emotional distress. Emotional distress is very easy to fake. We don't have a tool, a medically diagnostical tool that will corroborate your claim of emotional distress. I can't put a device on your head and ascertain that you're distressed. We're getting there. Some MRI machines can actually do that, but it's very difficult to take you immediately into an MRI to corroborate your distress. So we look for these physical symptoms. That becomes the requirement. So that's our near miss case. Second type of case that we will see is a bystander case. In a bystander case, a negligent defendant will cause serious injury or death to someone who is not a party in the current lawsuit. Negligent defendant causes serious injury or death to a non-party in the lawsuit. Let's call that direct physical victim X. The plaintiff in the case is emotionally sad because of the injury to X. The plaintiff is like, boo-hoo, poor X, crying over the fact that X is dead or badly hurt. Now, before I give you the added elements that you have to show in a bystander case, let me just call something to your attention. I think this is common sense, but sometimes it's good to bubble up and hammer on things that are obvious. You'll note that the emotion that is involved in the near miss case and the emotion that is involved in the bystander case, they're very different emotions. In the near miss case, what is the unpleasant emotion that the plaintiff suffers? I'm going to characterize it as fear, anxiety, worry over one's own physical safety. Oh my goodness, I almost got hit. In the bystander case, what is the negative emotion that you suffer? That emotion would be sadness, grief, melancholy, mourning over the loss of a person that you care about. So here are the requirements to recover in the bystander case. Number one, the plaintiff and the direct physical victim X must be close family members. They must be closely related. Close family members. Generally, that means parent, child, or spouse. There are some jurisdictions that have broadened the scope of close family relationship, but I think on the exam, they stick to those big three because those are the clear examples of close family relationship. This means if you see your spouse injured or killed by a negligent person, a drunk driver, let's say, you will have a potential bystander claim. But if you see your best friend, or if you see your aunt, or if you see your college roommate mowed down by a drunk driver, you will not have a claim. Now, this is arbitrary. It does not mean that your grief is not genuine. It's just the legal system drawing a bright line. I can't necessarily justify it. There are people who would say that they have a stronger bond with their college roommate than they might have with someone who's a direct family member. Too bad. The second thing that you have to show is that you witnessed the injury to X in real time. You saw it as it happened. You were right there physically co-located. You have to be on the scene, and you have to see it as it happens. Sometimes I sum this up by saying you got to be close in time, close in space, and close in relationship in order to have a valid bystander claim. So I've got Pete. He's sitting on his own front porch on a beautiful spring morning reading the Sunday paper, and his 5-year-old son is on the lawn playing with a little toy truck. At that moment, Dave comes barreling down their suburban street, absolutely intoxicated, driving 80 miles an hour, jumps the curb, and crushes the little boy. Pete sees this in real time as he's sitting on the porch, sees his son killed before his very eyes, a horrific image he'll never get out of his mind. He will have a valid bystander claim against that driver. Just note that in these cases, the direct physical victim will also have a separate and independent claim, of course. That's a simple negligence claim. If you get killed by a drunk driver, you can establish negligence because driving drunk is negligent. Third and final category of cases, probably my favorite kind because the cases are so variable, would be the business relationship cases. The business relationship cases involve a plaintiff and a defendant who are in a pre-existing business relationship where careless performance is highly likely to cause emotional distress. Pre-existing business relationship where careless performance is highly likely to cause emotional distress. So it's kind of vague. I mean, I see some of you making what I call scrunchy face. You're like, what? So let me see if I can be concrete. I want to give you 3 examples, 2 that are going to work and 1 that is a negative example. Example number 1, the business relationship is medical patient and medical laboratory. Here's the scenario. You go into the doctor because you have a strange growth on your arm. The doctor says, don't like the look of that. Let's take a sample and send it to the lab. The lab gets the sample and negligently performs their work and erroneously informs you that you have cancer. Are you emotionally distressed? Of course you are. Getting a positive cancer diagnosis is very traumatic. Is this foreseeable? It's totally foreseeable. If you're a lab that tests tissues for cancer, you know that screwing up will have this consequence. This is a good case for business relationship negligent infliction of emotional distress. Second positive example, business relationship, funeral parlor and patron. You go to a funeral establishment. First of all, let's stipulate you're already emotionally fragile. You're making final arrangements for someone who you care about, a family member or a friend. And is it foreseeable that if they screw up, you'll be more distressed? Totally. So what happens? You're making arrangements to put your grandmother to rest. You come back. They say, we've lost your grandmother. We can't find the body. Or you wanted to have a viewing, and you come back and they say, oh, we thought it was a cremation. There'll be no viewing because Granny has already been burned. Or they don't do the embalming properly. There are many ways that funeral establishments can make errors. If they do, and there's distress or agitation, there will be a good claim for negligent infliction of emotional distress. Now let me give you the negative example. Here's my business relationship. My business relationship, dry cleaner, customer. Customer brings in absolutely favorite shirt or absolutely favorite blouse to the dry cleaner, comes back 3 days later and the dry cleaner has destroyed the garment. It's absolutely shredded. All the colors have been bleached out, or maybe it's completely lost. And the customer just loses it. The customer has a major meltdown, is screaming, is popping arteries, is severely emotionally distressed. That case, there is no recovery. It is not foreseeable that screwing up the dry cleaning process will cause emotional distress. It's not a relationship predicated on that. Now, here, as in all of law, there can be close cases. There was an interesting case that came out of the District of Columbia not too long ago. A Jewish family arranged for a wedding reception and specified with the caterer that they absolutely needed to have kosher food, food that conformed to Jewish dietary laws. When people arrived at the reception, there were waiters already circulating, and what were they carrying around? Trays of shrimp. Shrimp is not a kosher food. The family was extremely agitated. The court said that that was not a good claim. Now, I think that's a borderline claim, but the court said that that was not a good enough claim. It was not like a cancer diagnosis. It was not like losing your grandmother's remains. They don't give you close cases on the bar exam. I cite that one merely to show you that, as in all law, these things can get fuzzy on the border. Okay? So that's what we have in the realm of negligent infliction of emotional distress. Time for a micro essay. Let's practice. Here's a fact pattern. Pamela, P name, going to be the plaintiff. Pamela was sexually harassed at work by her manager. In the course of the episode, she managed to surreptitiously get some video of the episode on her cell phone. The next day, she goes to a coworker named Carl. I give him a C name because he's a coworker. And she says, Carl, will you help me file a complaint about this? I don't know how to do that, but I'm very upset. And she gives Carl the video that she took. Carl then assists her filing a complaint with the federal government, the Equal Employment Opportunities Commission. And when management learns of this, they fire Carl. Carl, now out of a job, decides to hire a lawyer. And so he goes to Danielle and he says, will you sue the company because they fired me? And she says, fine, give me all the evidence you have. And Carl turns over the video that Pamela took of the sexual harassment. Danielle, the lawyer, now goes on TV because this case gets a lot of notoriety. And in the course of the TV interview, she shows the video. She shows the video. She says, my client has a great case for retaliation. He was assisting a true victim. Let me show you why she was a true victim. And puts this video on TV. Pamela is humiliated and distressed by this. She said, I didn't want what happened to me to be visible. So Pamela sues Danielle, the lawyer, for disclosing this video. She says it was negligent infliction of emotional distress. Do you think Pamela will win? Why or why not? This is based on a real case. This is actually a fairly recent case that came out of the District of Columbia. It's a 2015 case. I've simplified the facts, but only slightly. The court held that there was no cause of action. The reason that they held that there was no cause of action is because there was no direct relationship between Danielle, the lawyer, and Pamela, the plaintiff. Obviously, this is not a case that involves physical injury either to the plaintiff or to a third person. So it's not a near miss case, and it's not a bystander case. So the only kind of case it could be is a business relationship. But the prerequisite of recovery is that there has to be a relationship. And here, Danielle was lawyer for Carl. She was not lawyer for Pamela. And so the district court, the District of Columbia court, it was the highest court in D.C., they said that there would be no recovery because the business relationship simply did not exist. Okay? So that's a question with a little bit of a twist. If you got it right, awesome. That's fantastic. But if not, there's another thing to remember to think about if you're doing these. Remember, if there's no physical injury on the table, either threatened or to a third person, it's got to be a relationship case. And that requires a relationship. And then it requires the high foreseeability that we talked about. So now I'd like to turn your attention to the second element in the cause of action, which is breach of duty. The breach element in the negligence claim is the part of the case where the plaintiff must demonstrate exactly what the defendant did wrong, and must give a reason why it's wrong. It requires particularizing conduct and giving an explanation. You need fact plus reason in order to make a breach showing. The fact can be either affirmative or negative, but it has to be very specific. Plaintiff will allege that the breach here was that Dave had 8 martinis before he got in his car. That is a breach allegation. Plaintiff will allege here that the breach was that Dave failed to check the tire pressure in his tires before embarking on a long highway journey. That's an example of an omission or a failure to do something. Doing something stupid, drinking martinis, failing to do something that a reasonable person would do, checking your tire pressure, those are examples of specific breach conduct. But they must be coupled with a reason. You have to, especially on your essays, explain why this conduct falls short of the standard. You need a second sentence. Plaintiff will allege that the breach was that Dave had 8 martinis. Plaintiff will claim this was unreasonable because. Plaintiff will claim that this was unreasonable because, and now you must give a reason. The reason does not have to be profound. Indeed, you may think it to be self-evident. Put it down anyway. Plaintiff will allege that this was unreasonable because drinking alcohol impairs your ability to react to emergencies on the road. It impairs your ability to drive the car. That's all you need to say. Try to avoid making your reason circular. Try not to say, plaintiff will allege that this is unreasonable because reasonable people don't drink and drive. That's just an assertion. That's circular. You're saying this is unreasonable because it's not reasonable. So try to give a reason. But there is a reason. The reason why it's impermissible to drink and drive is because alcohol impairs your ability to drive. You know that. The reason that it's unreasonable to not check your tire pressure is because underinflated tires can blow out. And if they blow out, you'll lose control of the vehicle and you hit another car. You should know that. All right. If you don't know that, this lecture served 2 purposes, because you should check your tires. So these are basic exam taking hints. Where will you find the factual portion of the breach? It's going to be right there in the problem. Unlike a law school exam where sometimes you have to hunt for it, or you have to think, or you have to make a chain of inferences, for the most part in bar essays, it's staring you right there in the face. It's going to say in the problem, he had 8 martinis. So no treasure hunt. Where are you going to get the reason? From your common sense. Now, there's one very famous reason that we tend to use very infrequently on the bar exam. One very famous reason as to why a behavior might be short of the standard of reasonable prudence is that its costs outweigh its benefits. Cost-benefit analysis is something that you probably delved into, but for the most part, unless you see actual numbers in the exam, I don't recommend that you get into cost-benefit analysis unless it's very obvious. You know, if they tell you in the problem, somebody did not put a 3-cent bolt into a device. They carelessly forgot to put a 3-cent bolt into a device, and the result was $50 million of harm. You could say reasonable people spend 3 cents to avoid $50 million in loss. You could say that this violates a cost-benefit principle. But for the most part, just common sense. Beyond this, there is one and only one doctrine that I want you to know about in the law of breach. That is the famous doctrine of res ipsa loquitur. Res ipsa loquitur is a doctrine that is used by plaintiffs who lack information about what the defendant did wrong. They lack information. They are in some kind of an information vacuum. The best way for us to talk about this is to go to the facts of the most famous and the original res ipsa loquitur case. It is an English case from the 1860s. It's called Byrne v. Bodle. So let me tell you about Byrne v. Bodle. The facts are very short, and you may have read it. Mr. Burns walking down a street. This was in Liverpool, city of Liverpool in England. He was on a street called Old Scotland Road. I love it. And he walks past what they say in the opinion was a bake shop. I don't know, a bake shop. I guess that's a bakery. And it's a small building, but it's 2 stories. And as he walks past, a barrel, a wooden barrel filled with flour, falls or tumbles out of the upper window, hits him in the shoulder, knocks him to the ground, and he sustains injuries. So he brings a lawsuit against the owner of the bake shop, Mr. Bodle. So I want you to picture the trial of that case. There we are in England in the 1860s. England was the most powerful country in the world at that time, with an empire stretching around the globe. And their legal system, that was one of their pride and joys, right? They loved that whole British legal system. And so the courtroom was probably a pretty impressive place. Probably very richly furnished, wood paneling, royal crest behind the bench. And the judge was probably adorned in crimson robes, scarlet robes, with one of those wigs, curly white-haired wigs going all the way down to the shoulders. And the plaintiff comes in and tells his sorry tale about getting hit by this barrel of flour. And the judge would have looked at him, and the judge would have said, well, my good man, what is it that you allege that they did wrong? Is it your contention that they were hoisting the barrel with a rotten rope that snapped, causing it to tumble? Is that it? Or is it your contention that the members of the establishment were tossing the barrels back and forth as part of a game, and one barrel escaped from their control? Is that it? Or is it your contention that they store the barrels on their round sides rather than their flat bottoms? Which would be very foolish, I should say. Is that it? What is it that you contend that they did wrong? And the plaintiff would have looked at the judge and he would have said, I don't know. I don't know, Your Honor, because you bloody judges, you haven't invented discovery yet. I can't get in there and they won't answer me questions. And in normal course of a civil lawsuit, that case should have been dismissed. No evidence of a breach. No specification of why the barrel fell out. No indication of what exactly they did wrong. But the judge must have been in a good mood that day. Perhaps he had something particularly delicious for breakfast. Because he looked at the plaintiff and he said, oh, I see. You don't know, do you? Very good then. I'll make up some crap. Res ipsa loquitur, I say to you, because I speak Latin when I make up crap. That's basically what he did. Actually, let me clarify. This didn't happen at trial, at least as far as we know. It happened on appeal. So the judges are actually talking to each other, not to the plaintiff. So it's more like, oh, Baron Bramwell, res ipsa loquitur, don't you think? And Bramwell's like, yes, whatever you just said. I'll have 2. You know, he has no idea. But they just made it up. They just made it up. I love, when I cover this material, we have a lot of non-U.S. students at George Washington University. Some of them are LLM students, some of them are JD. And I love when I get to this stuff, because they come up after class and they're like, so American and British judges can just make things up? And I'm like, totally. And they're like, that's pretty crazy. I'm like, yeah, don't you love it? It's common law. They made it up. It's a get out of jail free card. It's a way that you can avoid a directed verdict. How do you do it? You make 2 substitute showings instead of direct evidence of a breach. Number 1, you got to show that the accident is of a type. It's a type of accident. It's a category of accident, which is normally associated with negligence. The key word is the word normally. That's the stress word, but it's also the word that you can use synonyms for. Because what we are doing on the first prong of res ipsa is making a statistical or probabilistic statement. What we are doing is confessing ignorance and falling back on stats. I don't know why the barrel fell out the window. Maybe a drunken employee staggered into it and knocked it out the window. Maybe they were hoisting it with a bad rope. Maybe this, maybe that, I don't know. But normally, which is to say usually, which is to say typically, which is to say ordinarily, properly handled barrels stay within the building, and when barrels start raining down on pedestrians, somebody screwed up. We reason backwards from the conclusion to some unspecified breach. I don't know what it was. I wasn't in there. I don't have surveillance footage. But statistically, ordinarily, probabilistically, it was probably associated with negligence. Second prong of the res ipsa doctrine is that you have to show that an accident of this type would normally be due to negligence of someone in the defendant's position. An accident of this type normally due to the negligence of someone in the defendant's position. Here again, memorizing is fine, but understanding is so much better. Because if you understand it, then it's easy to bring it back to your memory. What is this about? If you have not specified a particular breach, then how do you know you sued the right person? If I say Dave had 8 martinis before he got in the car, then I know that the person to sue is Dave. He's the one who drank the martinis. But if I don't know how the barrel fell out the window, then how do you know who to sue? Maybe the barrel fell out the window because the FedEx delivery guy was up there and he bumped into it. Not that they had FedEx in England in the 1860s, but you get my point. So you gotta establish that the likelihood is that you sued the right person. And how do you do that as a practical matter? You show that the defendant had control over the item, the injury-causing item at the relevant time. If the barrel was in the exclusive control of the bake shop, then whatever screw-up occurred, it's on them, and you're suing the right person. So that's the second prong of res ipsa. When you show these two things, you get to the jury. It's enough to satisfy a prima facie case of breach. But the jury can then come out with a verdict either way. They can decide the case in your favor, or they can decide for the defendant. There's no guarantee of victory just because you made a res ipsa showing. Okay? So that's what we have in the law of breach of duty. This takes me to the first of the two causation topics that I would like to explore with you, and that is factual causation. I do want to say one preliminary thing. There are two types of causation. We will get to proximate cause in just a few minutes. When you do your analysis on an essay question, if it is a negligence problem, you should always do factual causation first. I'm not going to bother to explain why. I just want you to take it on faith. If you do it the other way around, your answer will be incoherent. You'll lose points. Do factual cause before proximate cause. If you can't remember it any other way, alphabetical. F comes before P. Do factual cause first. Now, this element is the point in the case where the plaintiff establishes a linkage or connection between the breach and the injury suffered. We've already shown the breach. We've made that specific factual showing. Now I have to link it to the injury. It's a bridge. It's a connection. And how do I do that? The standard mechanism is through what is known as the but-for test. That's two words, B-U-T space F-O-R. I stress that because somebody came up to me one year and they said, what was the case for the factual cause? And I said, well, I didn't say a case. And he said, no, you did. It was something like the but-for case. No, it's not the but-for case. But for. It's a verbal phrase that requires us to ask whether the breach was essential in producing the injury. In fact, If you like Latin, and I mean really, who doesn't? If you like Latin, some people refer to this as the sine qua non test. Sine qua non means essential. Essentially, that's essential, right? And so that's the but-for test. What you normally do, therefore, is imagine a world where there is no breach. Imagine an alternative universe where the defendant has behaved reasonably. And run that scenario in your head. If in that world, the plaintiff is still injured, then the breach was not necessary to the injury, and therefore it's not a but-for cause. But if in that alternative universe, when there's no breach, the injury goes away, then the breach was obviously necessary or essential. That's the but-for cause. All right? Let's take a concrete example and work at a very simple example. I have a situation where a guy was crossing a rural road. There are no crosswalks. The only choice is to cross the road wherever you can. And he got hit by a car. He was hurt and he sued the driver of the car. After investigating, he comes up with a breach. He says, my alleged breach is that you looked away from the road momentarily to change the radio station, and that was unreasonable because it is important to keep your eyes on the road at all time to avoid hazards. So that's the breach allegation, and now we come to the causation part of the case. The causation part of the case requires a showing that looking away from the road was essential to causing injury. So what we do is we imagine a world where the driver doesn't look away, where the driver keeps his eyes riveted on the road and doesn't change the radio station. And the plaintiff says, if you had kept your eyes on the road, you would have seen me 2 seconds earlier. Just enough time to take your foot off the accelerator and slow down, which would have allowed me to safely get to the other side of the road. So, but for your tuning the radio, but for your looking away from the road, I would be safe and uninjured today. That would be a but-for causation argument. You make that argument, and if the jury buys it, you've established factual cause. Now, the defendant doesn't have to lie down and give up. The defendant is free to counter-argue. A defendant's counter-argument on factual cause usually begins with the words, even if. The defendant will say, even if I had been careful, you still would have gotten hurt. In my hypo, the defendant will say, even if I never looked at the radio, even if I had kept my eyes riveted on the road, I still would have hit you because you dashed out in front of my car at the last possible minute. You virtually threw yourself under my wheels. I had no time to stop, even if I had been looking at the road. If we get these two alternative visions of what might have happened, the jury will have to resolve it. It is up to the jury. Now, there may be evidence that provides us some information. Maybe there are skid marks that will tell us how far away the driver was when he first began to apply his brakes. And that might be helpful information. But that's how the but-for cause works, and it's not particularly complicated. Unfortunately, we do not use that test 100% of the time. There are two situations where we're going to use a different approach. Both of those involve multiple defendants. So I want to tell you about each of these in turn. First of them involves what I call merged cause scenarios. The classic example of merged causes, two negligently set fires. Two negligently set fires. I'm going to stipulate two defendants, multiple defendants. First guy's Dave. So what's Dave doing? Dave is driving a car, and he's smoking a cigarette. That's not negligent. It's okay to smoke. I mean, it's not healthy, but it's fine if you want to smoke. But then what he does when he finishes his cigarette is he throws the lit cigarette butt out the car window. That is not a reasonably prudent thing to do. And in my hypo, it lands in a bed of dry leaves. And within a matter of minutes, I now have a fire. I'll call that fire A, negligently set by Dave. At the same time, about a mile away, Doug, a totally unrelated person, is camping in the woods. And he decides, time to go home. Packs his gear, but fails to fully extinguish his campfire. He leaves those embers glowing, and the wind picks up. Soon enough, I have another fire. I'll call that fire B. Over the course of an hour, the two fires burn independently, but eventually they join. They merge after burning the intervening mile of woodlands, and now the combined fire burns down the plaintiff's house. The plaintiff sues both of these guys, Dave, who threw the cigarette butt, and Doug, who left the campfire. Somebody once asked me, well, how did he find them? I don't know. You have to just assume that he did, but it's a miracle that he did. But there were witnesses. He sues both of them. In this kind of a case, we have a merged cause case. In this case, the proper test of factual causation is what courts have called the substantial factor test. The substantial factor test. In this kind of substantial factor analysis, you ask whether each breach contributed to the injury in a significant or substantial way. The courts have not succeeded in providing any greater content to the substantial factor test. I would give you more concrete information if I had it. It doesn't exist. The restatement of torts, the third restatement of torts, basically trashes this test. They say, well, this is stupid. It doesn't mean anything. Well, maybe, but it's the law. It's what you find in the cases. And so it's what you should put in an essay. It's the appropriate analysis. I can give you this one subsidiary rule. If a breach, had it been the only breach in the story, would have been capable of causing all the harm by itself, then it's definitely a substantial factor. In my two fires hypo, either fire, if it had been the only fire in existence, would have burned the plaintiff's house. Therefore, both the cigarette toss and the campfire carelessness, both will be treated as substantial factors. Both breaches should be, therefore, considered factual causes. And what does that mean as a practical matter? If you determine that you have them both as substantial factors, then you hold those defendants jointly liable. Those defendants are jointly liable. It takes me to the other scenario involving multiple defendants, and that scenario is what I call the unascertainable cause case. Unascertainable cause. The standard example of this kind of situation is a California State Supreme Court case dating from the late 1940s. The name of the case is Summers versus Tice. The case involved an accident in the course of hunting. It was a hunting accident case, and so let me tell you what happened. As I tell you what happened, by the way, let me just mention, I don't know the first thing about hunting. I've never been, I don't have a clue. I don't have anything against it. Seems to me fine if you want to do it. But I always tell folks, my people just go to the deli. It's quicker. I don't need to kill my own food. Somebody did it for me. But if you want to kill your own food, go for it. That's great. So what are these guys doing? There are three guys out together. I'm going to call them Mo, Larry, and Curly. That's an old reference, but some of you will appreciate it. In any event, they're out hunting together. What are they? They're hunting quail. Now, the first step in hunting quail is you got to find the quail. And once you find, where do they live? They live on the ground. They're ground-dwelling birds. And then the next thing you do is you got to get them to come out from the shrubbery where they're hiding. Now, how do you do this? Well, I'm not 100% sure, But I think one way you do this is that there are some people who do this kind of hunting who carry with them these long sticks, and they put the sticks underneath the bushes and they kind of shake them, and the birds are so pissed off that they fly out. This apparently is the origin of the expression beating the bushes, which I love that, right? It's like when you say, oh, I've been looking for an apartment for 3 weeks. I've been beating the bushes trying to find something that's not too expensive. When you say beating the bushes, that's a reference to quail hunting. So after you beat the bushes, the quail flies out, bursts into the sky, and now's the exciting moment. You get to kill him. What kind of weapon do you use? Use a shotgun. It's a long barrel weapon. It shoots a cartridge filled with pellets. Your goal is to hit the quail with one pellet only. That will bring the quail down, kill it. You can cook it and eat it. You don't want to fire at point blank range and hit the bird with all the pellets, because that will vaporize the bird, which is amusing but leaves you nothing to eat. So we don't do that, okay? So back to my story. Mo has separated from his two compatriots. He's 100 yards away. Larry and Curly have found and flushed quail. There's one bird that's flying, and they think they have a shot. They both get their shotguns up and at the ready, but they don't fire immediately. They don't want to fire at point blank range. And so then all fall silent in that forest, except for the desperate sound of that one bird trying to get away. And they wait, and they wait, and they wait until the quail is directly in front of Mo's face. Fire. That is the moment that they both discharge their weapons. All the pellets go off harmlessly in the sky, except for one single pellet that enters Mo's left eye, leaving him blind in that eye. As far as we know, the bird got away completely unscathed. The bird is like, assholes, right? The bird. And I like talking animals. They're always entertaining. In any event, so the consequence is that Mo, of course, is going to sue these other two idiots, Larry and Curly. But Mo's got a problem. Only one pellet entered his eye. That means one defendant's carelessness blinded him. One defendant's carelessness factually caused his injury, and the other defendant's carelessness factually caused nothing. But which is which? Is it Larry who fired the injurious pellet, or is it Curly who fired the injurious pellet? We don't know. We don't know, and the plaintiff doesn't know, because they fired at the exact same minute from the exact same location. It is unascertainable. Simultaneous negligence, only one true source of harm, but you don't know which. That's unascertainable. And you might think you could fall back on statistics, but you can't, because it's a 50-50 probability that it was either of the two defendants, and the plaintiff must establish his case by a preponderance. And you have to show a preponderance on every single element. So here's what the California State Supreme Court did in Summers v. Tice. They just shifted the burden of proof. They said that in cases like the one I just described, it is up to the defendants to talk their way out of the case. If one of the defendants can explain that it couldn't have been me because, and they have a valid explanation, that defendant is off the hook. That defendant is not liable. But if neither defendant can carry the shifted burden of proof, then you go ahead and you hold those two defendants jointly liable. Shift the burden of proof. The unascertainable cause scenario is sufficiently elusive that I want to give you a second example. This is from an old MBE question, so you can see how they test it. They told you that Pete was in a car driving on a country road, and there were two farms on either side of the road. One was owned by Farmer Dave and the other was owned by Farmer Doug. You can see what's going to happen here. Each farmer owned a chestnut brown horse. The horses look quite similar to each other, solid chestnut brown. Farmer Dave negligently let the fences that separated his pasture from the road fall into disrepair. Farmer Doug negligently left a gate open in the gate that separated his pasture from the road. Pete, the driver, takes a curve in the road. What does he see in the middle of the road? A chestnut brown horse. To avoid hitting the horse, he swerves and he hits a tree. The horse gallops away, leaves the scene of the crime. So the injured party, Pete, sues Dave and Doug, the two farmers. He says, farmer number one, you were negligent because you let your fence fall into disrepair. Farmer number two, you were negligent because you let your gate open. And he doesn't know which one actually caused it. That's a case where we would apply the Summers v. Tice rule and shift the burden of proof. There was only one horse in the road. It was only one of the breaches that could have caused the harm, but we don't know which one. It's unascertainable. And therefore, it's up to the defendants to talk their way out of it if they can. So that's what you need to know about factual cause, and it permits me to turn to that other type of cause, one which has a little bit of a unsavory reputation maybe, and that's proximate cause. Proximate cause is definitely the stupidest name of any legal doctrine I can think of. It's just the worst name. It's ridiculous. It not only doesn't communicate what the doctrine is about, it is affirmatively misleading. So here's what I want to do at the very outset of our conversation. I want to swap in a shadow name for this element. Now, let me be very explicit. I don't want you to use this shadow name on the exam. This is only for inside your head for analytical clarity. When you write, you got to use the words proximate cause. But when you think about this element, I want you to call it fairness. I want you to call it fairness. What I mean to communicate is that at this point in the case, the plaintiff must convince us that liability would be fair. We are getting near the end of the case. The plaintiff has already shown duty, the plaintiff has already shown breach, and the plaintiff has already shown factual cause. We want now to take one last moment to make sure that we are invoking the judicial machinery for a good purpose. You can think of this element as an 11th hour sanity check. Plaintiff, just convince me that this is fair. I know you got these technical elements, but convince me that this is fair. Now, once we rename the element as fairness, I think you will quickly realize that in 98% of the negligence cases that we encounter in the real world, fairness is self-evident. Driver runs a red light, hits pedestrian, and breaks the pedestrian's legs. Is it fair that the driver should pay for the broken legs? 1 million out of 1 million people surveyed say yes. Restaurant negligently fails to clean up a spill, leaves grease on the floor for 20 minutes, customer slips in the grease, falls and breaks her hip. Is it fair that the restaurant should pay for the broken hip? 100 out of 100 people say yes. 1,000 out of 1,000 people say yes. So fairness, or to use the true name, proximate cause, is not an issue in most negligence litigation. And if you go back and look at your first-year torts casebook, I'm sure you've long since disposed of it, sold it, or shredded it, but if you were to have it and look back at it, what you would discover is that most of the cases outside the proximate cause chapter don't even have a discussion of proximate cause because it's unnecessary to discuss it because it is self-evident. Fairness is self-evident in 98% of the cases. But the legal system has to have a rule for the rare case. It can't ignore the rare case. The rare case will come up. In 2% of the time, I need a rule. And I have a rule. The rule is that if I have to decide fairness and it's debatable, then I will judge fairness by using the F word. And the F word is foreseeability. Fairness will be judged based on whether what happened was a foreseeable consequence of this particular breach. In other words, we think it's fair to make people pay for the foreseeable consequences of their careless acts. We think it's unfair to make people pay for the unforeseeable consequences, so we don't make them pay for the unforeseeable consequences. Let me give you an example as to where this fairness foreseeability principle might result in a limitation of liability. Let me give you an example where I think we might come to the conclusion of unfair. My example has a name. It's called Paul's graph without Paul's graph. I want you to assume that in the facts of Paul's graph, there is no Helen Paul's graph. She's not there. However, instead, there's a man who's uninvolved with the two dudes who are trying to catch the train, who is standing next to the Long Island Railroad employee. He was another patron, but he was standing right next to the Long Island Railroad employee. He wanted to ask him a question. Do I need to change trains at blah, blah, blah station in order to go to X? So he was waiting patiently to ask this question. And what happens? The railroad employee knocks the packages loose, and there's this big explosion, and this other passenger gets burned. Now, he is in the zone of danger. He does not confront the problem that Mrs. Paul's graph had. He is a foreseeable victim. The package could have fallen on his foot. But that's not what happened. What happened was that he got burned. So what you would need to do is you would say, okay, this is a weird case. This case is freakish. This case involves bizarre facts. So let me look at the breach and ask what things foreseeably are associated with the breach. The breach is shoving and knocking a package. What is associated with that? What risks can come from that? People can fall, and if they fall, they can get a bruise or they can get a broken bone. Knocking a package down could cause the contents of the package to break. Knocking a package down could cause the package to fall on someone's foot and thereby cause an injury in the form of a broken foot. All of those would have been foreseeable risks. But shoving and knocking a box do not foreseeably cause explosions and fires. That was a big surprise. And because it was a big surprise, the Long Island Railroad wouldn't be liable, because it would be unfair to make them liable. Now, most of us don't have a lot of sympathy for big railroads that have lots of money and lots of insurance coverage. But if you're concerned about fairness, you might say, it's not really fair for the railroad to be liable. They should not have responsibility for something that played out in such a surprising way. That's how this works. But remember, first question that you ask yourself is it an unusual or freakish or bizarre case? Because in 98% of the cases, fairness is self-evident. You don't even need to think about this if a driver runs a red light, hits pedestrian, and breaks leg. But if what happened was weird, you got to look back at the breach, catalog in your mind the risks that you would have expected beforehand, and then check the risk that materialized. That's a foreseeability analysis, and you do that in the spirit of fairness. Now, that's still pretty mushy. It's not very hard-edged. This is not like, working a problem under the Uniform Commercial Code. But it turns out that there are 4 scenarios in the area of proximate cause that have been litigated so often that we actually have precedent. I want to tell you about these 4 scenarios because they come up all the time. And I will give away the punchline at the beginning of the story by telling you that all four of these come out the same way. And in all four of these, the way they come out is courts have determined that the outcomes are foreseeable, that liability is fair, that the defendant should be treated as a proximate cause, and the plaintiff wins. So all four of them are symmetrical. They're all going to come out the same way. Here they are. Number one, cases involving intervening negligent medical treatment. Intervening negligent medical treatment, intervening medical malpractice. Defendant runs red light, hits pedestrian, breaks leg. Pedestrian is taken to the hospital, where a doctor does not conform to the customary standard and puts a cast on the leg that is too tight. The doctor commits medical malpractice. Indeed, the cast is so tight that this man loses blood circulation in that leg, and eventually the leg develops gangrene, and eventually the leg must be amputated below the knee. Is the driver liable only for the broken leg, which he caused instantaneously and which is self-evidently fair, or is the driver also liable for the amputated leg? Well, I already told you. The driver will be liable for the amputated leg. Why? All the courts consistently reason that when you hurt someone and drive them into the medical system, in a small but predictable number of cases, doctors will make things worse rather than better. That's not a slam against doctors. It's just the mathematical reality of every profession. There are some people who will make errors in every profession. Since such a thing is common, it's not going to happen the majority of the time, but it's not particularly surprising, we would say that it's foreseeable. And therefore, when it does come to pass, it's only fair that you should pay for it. And so we hold you responsible for that amputated leg. It's on your back. It's on your dime. It's your responsibility. We call you the proximate cause of that amputated leg. Now, in that fact pattern, I need to drop a footnote. In that fact pattern, the doctor who committed the medical malpractice is also going to be liable if that doctor gets sued because that doctor did not conform to the custom of other physicians by putting on that bad cast. I'm just not interested in the doctor right now. I'm only interested in the driver. But the driver would be liable for that amputation that came after the intervening medical malpractice because that's what the cases teach us. And although I walked you through the logic, you don't need the logic. It is a memorized rule. It is now in the case law. Second example of a settled case, intervening negligent rescue. Intervening negligent rescue. Defendant runs the red light, hits a pedestrian, breaks leg. A moment later, Good Samaritan arrives on the scene and sees this man in agony in the middle of the intersection. And the Good Samaritan thinks, the most important thing I need to do is get him out of the street. He's lying there like a human speed bump. I must get him to a position of safety. So the Good Samaritan drags him, grabbing him by the wrist, and tugs him to the sidewalk, but in the process dislocates the man's shoulder. Is the driver liable only for the broken leg that he caused directly, or is the driver also liable for that dislocated shoulder? The driver is liable for the dislocated shoulder. The courts reason that when you negligently hurt someone, rescuers will be attracted. And in a small but predictable number of cases, they will make things worse rather than better. So it's only fair that you should pay for it when they do. It's foreseeable that such a thing could happen, so it's fair that you pay for it. It's a well-settled rule. It's in the case law. Precedent. Category number 3, Intervening protection or reaction forces. Intervening protection or reaction forces. Not a great title, but it's the best I could come up with. Here's your fact pattern. Defendant runs a red light, enters an intersection crowded with pedestrians, hits one, and breaks his leg. All the other pedestrians freak out. They're like, there's a car in the intersection. And in order to protect themselves, and in reaction, they stampede to get out of the way. In the course of that stampede, that panicked reaction, one of these people steps directly on the face of the man lying in the street with the broken leg, leaving the word Nike permanently imprinted on the man's face. Is the driver liable only for the broken leg, or is he liable for the facial disfigurement as well? He's liable for the facial disfigurement. I will not try your patience by repeating the logic again. We think it's fair. He should pay. Fourth and final member of this quartet of cases would be subsequent disease or accident. Defendant runs red light, hits pedestrian, breaks leg. Pedestrian goes to hospital, gets a good cast from a great doctor, no problem there, and of course the accompanying pair of crutches. But because he's never used crutches before, the next day he loses his balance and he falls and he breaks his arm. The driver will be liable for the broken arm as well as the broken leg, because it is foreseeable that if you leave someone in a weakened condition, they may have that second accident. It's only fair that you should pay. These things all strike us as fair as measured by foreseeability. So that's our quartet of settled cases. I think what we should do is we should practice. You guys have been sitting here quietly absorbing. Let's get you into active mode. Let me tell you facts of a problem. This one is also from a real case from the state of Georgia. Here's the problem. Jenny and Paula are having lunch together at Diver Dan's seafood restaurant. Okay? Jenny, you could tell by her name, she's not even involved in the lawsuit that's going to come. There's a J name. Jenny ordered a shrimp cocktail as appetizer. And it turned out that Diver Dan's had failed to refrigerate the shrimp. They had left it out on the counter overnight, and it had developed bacteria. When Jenny finishes her shrimp cocktail, she turns to her companion, Pamela, and says, "I'm not feeling well. Will you excuse me?" And she goes to the ladies' room. Jenny is gone for quite some time. Pamela becomes concerned and goes to check on her. When she opens the door to the ladies' room, she sees Jenny, and Jenny is doing what in college we used to call talking to Ralph on the big white telephone. Okay? This is basically she's got her head in the toilet and she's throwing up because she's sick to her stomach because of the shrimp. So Pamela wants to hasten to her friend and see if she can provide any assistance. And in her haste, she does not notice a puddle of vomit on the hard tile floor of the bathroom, which had been placed there by Jenny just a moment earlier when she couldn't make it all the way to the to the toilet. So as Pamela is hastening through the bathroom, she steps in this puddle. Her feet go out from under her. She falls and she breaks her arm. She sues the restaurant in a negligence claim, asserting that the breach was the failure to refrigerate the shrimp. Will Pamela succeed in her claim against Diver Dan Seafood? Yes or no? And write out a one-sentence why. Okay? Yes or no, and write a one-sentence why. And I can actually see you, and some of you are not writing, so do it. Try it. Just yes or no. I know you're on the laptop, so you're just like hitting random keys. but no, I'm teasing. You obviously don't have to do these exercises, but they're really helpful. The Intermediate Appellate Court in the state of Georgia decided that Pamela did not have a valid claim. She did not have a valid claim because there was no proximate cause. If we look at this as a somewhat freakish occurrence, which I think it is, if we look at it as a somewhat freakish occurrence, we have to look at the breach and we have to ask, what are the risks associated with the breach? The breach was serving tainted food. What are the risks of serving tainted food? The risks are that people will get ill. But what happened here is a broken bone. Broken bones do not normally result from serving people contaminated or rotten food. This was an unforeseeable outcome, and therefore the court felt liability would be unfair, and therefore they exonerated the restaurant. So that is at least one good example as to how this works. Okay? So I think having just given you that exercise, now you've earned a rest. This is for those in the room, of course. Let's go ahead and take another 10. We will then resume with the balance of our material when we come back.
This marks the beginning of a 10-minute break. The 10-minute break is ending.
So we have one final element of the negligence prima facie case to cover, and that element is the easiest, I think, of all. There's only one subsidiary topic to talk about. The element, of course, is damage. Can't win a negligence case unless something bad happened to you. You don't recover just for abstract negligence. You have to suffer a detriment. The testable principle here is the famous and amusingly named eggshell skull doctrine. Under this doctrine, once the other elements have been established, the plaintiff will recover for all harm suffered, even if it is surprisingly great in scope. You recover for all harm, even if it is surprisingly great in scope. This is often rephrased as you take your plaintiff as you find your plaintiff. You take your plaintiff as you find him or her. And what it means is if somebody has a frailty of some kind, that's tough on you. You're at a cocktail party, you're making your way to the bar, and you're drunk. You're drunk, and so you're not walking right. You're kind of shaky. You're kind of weaving back and forth, and you bump into another partygoer, and you knock him or her down to the ground, and they fall, and they sustain a bad bruise. If they would choose to sue you, they would recover for a bad bruise. You are definitely not acting as a reasonably prudent person. Reasonably prudent people don't drink to the point of intoxication because it makes it difficult to walk through the crowd safely. But what if you knock this person to the ground and they have the disease known as osteoporosis, a disease that makes your bones extremely brittle, so when they fall to the ground, they crack into multiple pieces. You would be liable for all of those multiple fractures because you take your plaintiff as you find your plaintiff. The thing to note about the eggshell skull doctrine over and above its simple definition is that it applies to every tort on the bar exam. I am taking it up in the context of negligence because that's where it's most heavily tested, but it is technically a universal principle of tort law. It applies to every tort. I walk up to you, and I punch you in the nose. And as a result, you get a bloody nose. What are you going to sue me for? You'll sue me for battery. That's not a negligence tort. I did it on purpose. That was a harmful or offensive contact with your person. Yeah, I got a bloody nose. I have to pay you for a bloody nose. But what if I walk up to you and I punch you in the nose, and your head literally cracks apart, and a viscous yellow substance begins oozing out of your skull? You literally have an eggshell skull, and I cracked it open, and I've now scrambled you. Well, I would have to pay for that, all right? I would love to see it. I would actually pay to see it, but I would have to pay for that because you take your plaintiff as you find your plaintiff. All right? We are now going to turn our attention to the defenses in the law of negligence. I use the word defenses, but I really should make it singular. Historically, there were multiple defenses. Historically, we had a doctrine known as contributory negligence. We had a doctrine known as assumption of the risk. Both of these doctrines are now minority positions in the United States. Indeed, they're extreme minority positions, and so we're not going to talk about them. They do survive in various jurisdictions, but the dominant rule, and the rule you need to know for the test, is the rule of comparative negligence. Under the law of comparative negligence, the defendant must show that the plaintiff failed to exercise proper care for his own safety. Failed to exercise proper care for his own safety. Now, obviously, the word proper is where the interest is going to be. What do we mean by proper care? Well, normally we mean reasonable prudence. The amount of care that you should exercise to protect yourself from getting hurt is exactly the same amount of care as you should exercise to prevent others from getting hurt, the care of the reasonably prudent person. But proper care can also include a self-protective statute. The classic example of a self-protecting statute is the law that forbids jaywalking. The jaywalking statute is a law that says you can't cross the street in the middle of the block. You have to go to the corner where there's a controlled intersection. You're not supposed to step out between two parked cars. The reason for the law is to protect you from your own foolish act, because that would be a way for you to get hurt if you don't obey the law. So, defendant offers evidence that plaintiff failed to exercise proper care for his or her own safety. At that point, the jury will be instructed to weigh the carelessness of the two litigants and to assign each litigant a percentage number. And the plaintiff's recovery is reduced based on the plaintiff's percentage of fault that has been assigned to him or her. The jury weighs and compares the negligence of the two parties, assigns them both a number, and the consequence is a damage reduction. There are no legal rules that govern the assignment of those numbers. It is subjective in the extreme. It is completely committed to the discretion of the jury. They will not ask you whether a certain set of numbers is correct or incorrect, nor will they ask you to calculate the numbers on your own. They can't, because there's no rational way that they could grade it. The key that they will usually want to test on, the key fact that they want to test on, is the calculation of the damage reduction. So here's the kind of situation that they will give you. Dave was driving down a street, and he was drunk at the time, and Pete was a pedestrian. Pete stepped out in the middle of the street between two parked cars, and Dave hit Pete. Dave caused $100,000 of damage. Pete had very serious injuries. He needed an operation. It was a very bad car accident. He missed a lot of work. His damages were $100,000. The jury determined that Dave, the drunk driver, was 80% to blame, and Pete, the jaywalking victim, was 20% to blame for his own misfortune. 80-20. They could have come up with any numbers, but those are the numbers I'm picking. How much would the plaintiff recover? He proved $100,000 in damages. He was assigned 20% of the fault. He will only recover $80,000. His damages are reduced by his own percentage of fault. Now, when I run through this, sometimes people say to me, are you telling me that I may actually have to do math on the bar exam? And the answer is yes. You may have to take 20% of 100. If you can't, I got nothing for you. You're out of luck. You're going to get that one wrong. I don't know what to tell you. But they will almost always make it 100,000, and they will always I can't remember when they've ever made it anything other than a round number percentage. So it's pretty easy. The math is, even within the realm of lawyer math, it's pretty easy. Okay? Now, the last thing I want to tell you about comparative negligence, there are actually two variants on the scheme as you look from state to state in the United States. The method of comparative negligence, or the system of comparative negligence, that is your default on the bar exam, is what is called pure comparative. And in that system, we go strictly by the numbers. And that means even if the plaintiff is assigned the larger percentage of fault, plaintiff still goes home and gets some recovery. A 90% faulty plaintiff, a drunken plaintiff who falls asleep in the middle of an interstate highway and who is found 90% to blame when he's run over by a speeding driver, would still get 10% of his recovery if the jury assigned 10% of the blame to the speeding driver for going too fast. On the other hand, there is a system which they may test on. I think it's a remote possibility, but they may test on it. If so, they will mention it by name. And that is known as either modified or partial. I've seen them use both names. Modified or partial comparative negligence. In that system, plaintiff fault of 50% or less reduces recovery. Plaintiff fault over 50% is an absolute bar, and the plaintiff gets zero. So a 40% negligent plaintiff gets 60% of the proven amount of damages. But a 70% negligent plaintiff goes home with zero. That's in the modified or partial system, which, as I say, I think it's a long shot for testing, and they would have to mention it by name. Use pure comparative unless they instruct you otherwise. That is in the formal MBE instructions. Okay? So we are now done with negligence, and we are going to turn our attention to strict liability. There are three causes of action in strict liability. I have arranged them in ascending order of importance. The first and least consequential, maybe one multiple choice question: strict liability for animals. Strict liability for animals. The animal cases require you to distinguish two broad groups of animals. The first are the domesticated animals. Domesticated animals are house pets and livestock. Dogs and cats, cows and horses, goats and sheep. That's not meant to be an exhaustive list. People write that. Don't write that list down. You know what? House pets and farm animals. Okay? The rule with respect to these creatures is that you're not strictly liable. No strict liability. Anyone who's hurt by your dog, anyone who is hurt by your horse, they would have to establish some negligence on your part, which would be a very hard thing to do. But there is a testable exception. If your animal has vicious propensities, and these are known to you, now you will be strictly liable. There is strict liability for keeping a domesticated animal with known vicious propensities. Now, the first thing I want to do is make sure you appreciate the vicious propensities that I'm talking about have to be unique to this one creature and not common to the entire species. All mules or donkeys will kick occasionally. That's behavior that is common to a mule. All bulls will put their heads down and charge occasionally. That doesn't make a kicking mule or a charging bull an animal with vicious propensities. The classic animal with vicious propensities is a dog that bites human beings, a dog that bites people. Dogs have been bred to not do that, but some do. A dog that bites people is a vicious dog, and you will be strictly liable if you have knowledge of that vicious propensity. What's going to give you knowledge of that propensity? The answer is that your dog has previously bitten someone. Once your dog bites someone, you now know that your dog is the rare dog that bites people. And so now if you continue to keep that dog, you will be strictly liable. This is the origin of the stupid expression, every dog gets one free bite. I don't know if you ever heard that expression. That is a common expression in English, just colloquial speech. Every dog gets one free bite. First of all, it's ridiculous. The dog gets as many free bites as he wants. It's the master who gets one free bite. But it's designed to capture the notion that the first bite puts you on notice. The first time your dog bites someone, you can pretend to a little surprise. You're like, Rover, what's up with that? But thereafter, you're on notice. And the law assumes your dog will be a recidivist. And so, bite one, no strict liability. Bites two through infinity, yep, strict liability. And then just to make this as elaborate as possible, no, just to be thorough, the rule of strict liability for a dog with known vicious propensities does not apply to trespassers on your land. Even though your dog has previously bitten someone and you choose to keep that dog because you're fond of it, If that dog bites a trespasser on your land, you're not strictly liable. The strict liability rule only applies to people out on the public street when you take your dog for a walk, or it applies to social guests in your home or business customers at your place of business. When we shift our focus to the other type of animal, the law is much more straightforward. It's streamlined. If we are dealing with wild animals, then there is strict liability. Period. No first bite needed. No knowledge needed. You keep a wild animal, you're strictly liable from the get-go. The exam trick on the infrequent occasions when they have tested it is that safety precautions are irrelevant because it's strict liability. I don't care about your safety precautions. Dan has a pet tiger, which he keeps in his backyard in suburban New York City. But Dan is a very prudent man. He's the epitome of prudence. And so he has gotten the best tiger cage that money can buy. He obtained it from Siegfried and Roy when they retired their act. Not only that, he puts 4 locks on that cage to make absolutely sure of security. And not only that, he checks the cage twice a day, every day, 365 days a year. Nonetheless, somehow or another, the tiger has managed to get free and has eaten the neighbor's child. Dan will be strictly liable. You're strictly liable regardless of your safety precautions. Of all the things that I've been asked over the years, the thing that I probably have gotten asked about more often than anything else is people come up to me and they ask me to categorize specific species of animals. I don't know why people are fascinated by this, but I get so many of these questions. Okay. Literally the very first summer that I was working with Barbary doing a bar review lecture, somebody in Pittsburgh came up to me and he's like, "What about an elephant?" I didn't know what to say to the guy. I'm like, yes, an elephant is a wild animal. I mean, I quoted to him a book I had read in the 2nd grade. You know, E is for elephant, the wild animal. and he was like, but they're domesticated in India. Well, I don't know whether they are or they aren't, but I said to him, "Are you taking the Pennsylvania bar or the India bar? Because they're not domesticated in Pennsylvania, all right? That's pretty obvious." And over the years, people have asked me about all kinds of animals. One year I got a question, what about monkeys? What about monkeys? Yeah, monkeys are wild animals. Monkeys are vicious. I mean, I don't know if you know, they're like very, very dangerous, very aggressive animals. So yeah, but here's the thing. If they want to ask you a wild animal question, if they want to burn one of their multiple choice opportunities to test your fitness to practice law by asking you a wild animal question, it's going to be lions or tigers or bears. They're not going to go with some exotic animal and force you to engage in close cases of line drawing. This is not like law school, right? You're not going to be sitting there reading question 142. Dave came home early one night and was disturbed to discover that his llama had escaped. And you're going to be like, "Oh, I could go either way on the llama. I don't know. I think they're domesticated in Peru. That's not what they do, right? It's going to be a lion or a cat, all right? So a pussycat. So it's that easy. And I tell you this because law students develop a habit, and if you're newly graduated, you probably still have that habit, which is to always try to go to the fuzzy boundary. That's a good habit to have as a lawyer. But for this exercise, you'll drive yourself insane to no good purpose. So don't do that. Let me talk about a different category of strict liability. That's going to be strict liability for abnormally dangerous activities. Abnormally dangerous activities. The only thing you really need to know here is the definition of an abnormally dangerous activity, and I'm going to give it to you, but I'll give you a shortcut when we're done. An abnormally dangerous activity is an activity that meets a 2-part test. Part 1 is that the activity creates a foreseeable risk of serious harm And again, you can change that to significant harm, severe harm, even when reasonable care is exercised. Foreseeable risk of big harm, even when you're careful. In other words, reasonable care cannot shrink the amount of risk down to a comfortable level. The amount of risk that is still remaining is great. This is just a puffed up way of capturing the category heading. In other words, the activity is abnormally dangerous because even when engaged in carefully, it still produces a risk of a bad outcome. Big deal, bad outcome. Second criterion or requirement for an abnormally dangerous activity is that the activity is uncommon in the community where it is being conducted. Uncommon in the community where it is being conducted. It's out of context. If everybody is doing it, the activity may be dangerous, but by definition, it's not abnormally dangerous because everybody's doing it, so it's normal. So that's the two-part definitional test. You would use that on an essay question, but the odds of an essay question on abnormally dangerous activities, I think, pretty low. On the multiple choice exam, I think you can use a shortcut. They tend to come back to the same three types of abnormally dangerous activities. Know these, you could do it flashcard style. You don't need to think about the definition. The first activity is anything involving explosives. Dynamite, TNT, plastique, nitroglycerin, any explosive materials. Obviously, the context will change every time they use it or test it, because there are lots of different ways that people legitimately use explosives. Maybe you're in the demolition business. You take down old buildings. Maybe you're in the mining business. You mine coal or other elements out of the earth, and you use explosives to open up mine shafts. These are all abnormally dangerous activities. Second, anything involving highly toxic chemical or biological material. Excuse me. Highly toxic chemical or biological material. I have a laboratory. They're doing research. What are they doing research on? They're trying to find a cure for the Ebola vaccine. And they have live Ebola cultures in the lab. That's an abnormally dangerous activity. Third, and finally, anything involving radiation or nuclear energy. Anything involving radiation or nuclear energy. You will know on the multiple choice exam that you stumbled across the abnormally dangerous activity question when the name of the defendant's business is Dave's House of Plutonium. Okay, that's usually an abnormally dangerous business. Now, here again, I reiterate what I said about wild animals. Safety precautions are irrelevant. And that's the way they test. They load the question up with safety precautions. Delta Demolition is a demolition company that uses dynamite in its operations, but it is the most prudent demolition company ever. It's got sirens, it's got warning signs, it puts gates and fences around its work areas, and then something happens and somebody gets hurt. They're liable. It's strict liability. Safety precautions are irrelevant. So we come now to the big event, and that would be strict liability for products. Strict liability for products. There are two preliminaries that I want to get out on the table. The first, I think, is pretty easy. The second, maybe, well, they're both easy, but the second one, I think, is a kind of important exam-taking hint. The first point I want to make is that when we refer to products, we are referring to both consumer products and industrial products. The product that may be involved in a product's case can be almost anything. It can be a small appliance that you have in your home, a toaster, a blender, a waffle iron. It can be a car, a boat, or a motorcycle. It can be a food product, such as a can of tuna fish or a bottle of olives. But it can also be something that you would not encounter in the home at all. It can be something that you encounter in a factory, a forklift truck, a drill press. Indeed, a huge number of product liability cases involve industrial machinery that lacks safety features, such as guards to prevent your hand from getting mangled. So just be alert to the enormous range of products that could be involved. They can use some creativity in writing these questions. Second point, understand that if somebody gets hurt by a product, they almost certainly will have multiple possible causes of action. If you have a blender at home and it hurts you, you may be able to bring a negligence claim against the company that manufactured the blender. Maybe they put it together and they did something careless. They forgot to tighten some screws. If you don't have direct evidence of what they did wrong, maybe you could rely on res ipsa loquitur. So you may have that cause of action. You may have a cause of action against them for the breach of warranty of merchantability that arises under Article 2 of the Uniform Commercial Code. You may, if they lied about the product, have a claim for a misrepresentation or even outright fraud. And as we will see in a moment, you may have a claim for strict liability. The reason that I tell you this is because you have to read carefully and make sure that you are analyzing under the theory that they have asked about. If the call of the question says she wouldn't be Denise. Patricia sued the department store for negligence. If you use a strict liability analysis, you will get it wrong. And what's worse, they almost always have one of the wrong answers that maps onto that strict liability analysis. So once again, as I said much earlier in our time together, this is 50% a test of reading comprehension. You got to make sure you're using the right theory if they specify a theory, and you have to look at theories both in the body of the question and then in the choices if the choices mention a theory. Now, if the theory is strict liability, what I want to do is go back to listing elements. There are 4 elements that a plaintiff must show. Element number 1 is that the defendant is a merchant. You can't rely on strict liability unless you're suing someone who is a merchant. A merchant is someone who routinely deals in goods of this type. A merchant routinely deals in goods of this type. It is not a particularly intricate requirement, but I have seen them manipulate it 4 different ways over a series of years. Let me tell you the variations on this theme that I have seen. Number 1, they will ask about a casual seller. A casual seller is you or me, usually selling used goods. In the old days, it would have been through the classified section of the newspaper or at a garage sale. Now, of course, online. A casual seller is by definition not a merchant and cannot be strictly liable. If you put your car up for sale on Craigslist, someone buys it, and then the brakes fail, you are not going to be strictly liable. You may be liable under a different theory, but for strict liability, you're off the hook because you're not a merchant. Second way I've seen them test on this, service providers. Service providers sometimes make products available incidental to the service. But they are not considered merchants of those products. And therefore, they are not strict liability. They are not strictly liable, if something goes wrong with the product. You go to your doctor's office, take a seat in the waiting room, and the chair collapses. There's obviously something wrong with the chair. The doctor is not strictly liable. Why not? Because the doctor is not a merchant o' chairs. He is a vendor of professional medical services. You clearly will have another cause of action there. You're an invitee. That chair was a hidden hazard. It seems to me like it was a reasonably knowable trap. You probably have a premises liability negligence claim, but you don't have strict liability. Third way I've seen them mess with the merchant requirement, commercial lessors. Commercial lessors, people who are in the business of leasing stuff. These folks are merchants. This one comes out the other way. This is a yes. They are merchants. They can be strictly liable. The easy example is a rental car company. You go down on vacation to the state of Florida, you rent a vehicle, you get 5 miles from the airport, and the brakes fail on that rental car. The rental car company is strictly liable. Fourth and finally, parties up the distribution chain with whom you did not deal directly. Parties up the distribution chain, wholesaler, manufacturer, with whom you did not deal directly. They are also merchants, and they are also strictly liable. That means that not only is someone injured by a product likely to have multiple theories, they are likely to have good claims against multiple defendants. You are able to sue the retailer and the wholesaler and the manufacturer. Now, that last point is sometimes put in legal jargon, and the legal jargon is to say there is no requirement of privity of contract to bring a strict liability claim. And that simply means that you can sue people that you didn't deal with directly. So that's element number one. It's not intellectually complicated, and with those 4 examples, I think we've covered 99% of the way that they could test. Element number 2 is that the product must be defective. The plaintiff must show that the product suffers from a defect. On the multiple choice exam, they sometimes stipulate to the defect. They literally will use the word defective as an adjective. Mary purchased a defective waffle iron. John was using a defective drill press at work. If they say it's defective, yay, this element requires no analysis. But you do sometimes have to analyze this element, and on an essay question, you always have to analyze this element, so here's what you need to know. There are 3 different kinds of defect, any one of which is sufficient to entitle the plaintiff to move forward with the case. The first is a manufacturing defect. A manufacturing defect. A product has a manufacturing defect when it differs from all the others that came off the same assembly line in a way that makes it more dangerous than consumers would expect. It differs from all the others that came off the same assembly line in a way that makes it more dangerous than consumers would expect. If you don't like that definition, there's an alternative definition in the Restatement Third. It amounts to the same thing, but the Restatement Third of Products Liability says that a product has a manufacturing defect when it departs from its intended design. So if every one is supposed to have 5 bolts, and this one only has 4 bolts. If it's supposed to have a smooth edge, but it has a jagged edge, it's the departure from the intended design that makes it defective. And if you prefer colloquial language, I refer to this as the 1 in a million. It's the 1 in a million anomalous product that is different from all of its siblings. It's the 1 in a million car that begins to vibrate so severely when you get it up to 50 miles an hour that you can't control it, or it won't steer properly. It's the 1 in a million toaster that when you go to press down the lever to make toast, you get an electric shock. It's the 1 in a million lawnmower where the blade comes off the housing and cuts your leg as you're about to mow the lawn. Or it's the 1 in a million can of tuna fish where there's a sharp piece of metal inside the fish, and when you eat the fish, it cuts into the roof of your mouth. Or it's the 1 in a million bottle of soft drink that has a dead rodent at the bottom of the bottle. The only other thing I can tell you about manufacturing defects, because they're very simple and very easy and straightforward, is that safety precautions do not matter. Again, it's strict liability. If they tell you that there was a piece of metal in the can of tuna fish, and then they go on to tell you that the company that made the tuna fish was the most careful food processor ever known in American history, it had state-of-the-art quality control, it had magnets all over the place to prevent metal from getting into the food, it had safety inspectors, 6 safety inspectors per production line, don't care. It's strict liability. Second kind of defect that you might have is a design defect. Design defect. Design defect law has been extremely controversial, extremely political, and extremely unsettled for a long period of time. And it remains, to a certain extent, in that posture. Here is your basic information. They're not going to take you very deep into it because they can't. There's too many loose ends. A product has a design defect if the costs of the design outweigh the benefits of the design such that a reasonable merchant would not have put it on the market. The costs outweigh the benefits such that a reasonable person would not have put it on the market. Costs of a design are usually its tendency to hurt you. Benefits of a design can be things like it makes the product easier to use. It makes it more comfortable to hold. It makes it quicker to use. Benefits can be things that make the cost of the item lower. They reduce the manufacturing expenses. So there's always a balance between incorporating safety features that may make the product heavy or cumbersome or slow or expensive, or leaving those safety features off in order to make the product light and easy to use, but obviously a little bit more risky. And so the test is, do the costs of danger outweigh the benefits of the types that I just mentioned, such that a reasonable person wouldn't market the product? And if on hearing this, you're saying to yourself, now wait a second, you're talking costs and benefits and reasonable people. I thought this was strict liability. That sounds a hell of a lot like negligence. You are exactly correct. Because the law of design defect, although for some strange reason continuing to be considered part of the strict liability claim, is actually a form of negligence liability. Now, the most testable aspect of all of this is, how does the plaintiff establish that the costs outweigh the benefits? That there should have been more safety built into the design, that there should have been a hand guard, that there should have been a softer and rounder edge on that toy for my child. Well, usually it is by offering evidence of a reasonable alternative design. In effect, what the plaintiff does is say, you could have built it better. You could have built it better without making anything negative happen. Let me show you how. Your failure to do that is evidence that what you put on the market is unreasonable. So the plaintiff must show a reasonable alternative design, and normally that alternative design meets 3 tests. Number 1, it's safer than the product marketed. The hypothetical alternative design is a safer design. Number 2, it is economically feasible. The alternative design is about the same price to manufacture. It's economically feasible. And number 3, It's practical. It doesn't make the product difficult to use. If such an alternative design exists, then that suggests that the costs of the actual design outweighed its benefits because there's a better way to build it, and that makes the product effective. Let me give you a concrete example which I think makes this clear. Some people have told me this is based on real facts. I've never bothered to look. It doesn't matter. It's a good example even if it's a hypo. So here's the example. Supposedly back in the early decades of the 20th century, 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, the vertical slats in baby cribs were more widely spaced apart than is customary today. And with that design, it was apparently the case that some babies could get their baby heads through the slats, and then they would get trapped and struggle and sometimes choke, and tragedy would result. Now, let us say that you brought a cause of action because you had suffered such a tragedy. Your child died, and you claim that that crib was defectively designed. It had a design defect. You claim that the costs, that is the risks of that product, outweighed its benefits. You would show that by saying, I can give you an alternative way to design the crib. Now, I want you to think for 1 second of an alternative way to design the crib. Rack your brains now. I know you're not all engineers, but can you think of a better way to design the crib? Yeah, move the slats closer together, right? Because now even the most energetic baby is reduced to harmlessly banging his head against the side of the crib. He can't get his head through, right? Now, does that design meet the three-part test? Is it safer? Yes. No strangled babies. Is it cost effective? Is it economically feasible? Sure. You might have to spend a couple of dollars to get one extra piece of wood, and then you just reposition. And is it practical? Yep. The crib still functions perfectly as a crib. Baby still gets plenty of air and light and visual stimulation, and you can still see the baby and touch the baby and put your fingers through the slats and tickle the baby. And so it is a good alternative design. Those old cribs were defective. That takes us to the very last kind of product defect, and that would be an information defect. If a product has residual risks that cannot be designed out, it has some risk that can't be designed away. And every product has some risk that can't be designed away. And if that risk is not obvious or apparent to users, the product is defective if it lacks adequate warnings and instructions. If a product has residual risks that are not apparent to consumers, the product is defective if it lacks adequate warnings. Now, like I said, all products have residual risks. A kitchen knife has a residual risk, namely that you could cut yourself. And you can't design that out because there's no alternative design. The only way to get rid of that risk would be to make the knife dull. But if you make the knife dull, it ceases to function as a knife. It's not practical. So that risk is a residual risk. But the thing about the risk of cutting yourself with a knife is that it's a perfectly obvious risk. So you don't need a label that says, warning, do not run tongue along blade. That's unnecessary. But if the risk is hidden, the product needs a warning. And the key testable point is that the warning has to be adequate. Not all warnings are created equal. So what are some of the issues that come up regarding adequacy of warning? Well, number one, placement. Putting a warning on page 6 of the instruction booklet may not be adequate. Perhaps the warning needs to be on a big red sticker at the point of use. What else? Comprehensibility. Perhaps the warning is too complicated in the way that it is worded. Or perhaps the warning is in English only, and it should be bilingual. Perhaps the warning shouldn't use words at all. Perhaps it should use icons for people who are either too lazy to read or who don't know how to read. What else? Well, sometimes risk mitigation information. Warning may not be enough unless it is accompanied by risk mitigation. Imagine that a company is selling some kind of insecticide that you're supposed to spray on your rose bushes. And it has a warning and it says, warning, toxic fumes. Is that an adequate warning? Maybe not. Maybe it should say, warning, toxic fumes, wear mask while using. In other words, instruct you how to mitigate the risk if there is a logical way to mitigate the risk. Give you that information as well. So when you look at these questions, look at the warning and ask yourself whether or not you think the warning is adequate or if it would have been easily improved upon. That's usually the big issue. Okay? I will tell you that in the real world, manufacturers are extremely paranoid about liability for information defects. They're very gun shy, and that is why products now are festooned with warning labels. It's been years since I bought one, but the last time I bought a ladder, I went to a big box store. I needed a ladder for my house, and so I went out and I bought a ladder. The thing had like 9 warning labels on it. You would have thought it was like a death-dealing piece of machinery. I mean, all kinds of things. You know how there's a little shelf that you can flip down where you can put your can of paint on the ladder? There was a sticker that said, "Do not stand on this shelf." I can't. The person who would do that should, in fact, be eliminated from the gene pool. I think that is like really hilarious. But in any event, you will appreciate this if you ever choose to go into this line of work, that the lawyers are like, put the sticker on. What's the harm in putting the sticker on? So that's information defects. Okay? Let us move forward to element number 3. Element number 3 in the strict liability cause of action is that the plaintiff must show that the product has not been altered since it left the defendant's hands. This element is an easy element for most plaintiffs because there is a presumption that the product has not been altered so long as it moved in what we call ordinary channels of distribution. In other words, you got it from an ordinary retailer who got it from the wholesaler who got it from the manufacturer. There is a presumption that the product that you buy from the retailer is in the same shape as when it left the factory floor. It moved in ordinary channels of distribution. So effectively, the plaintiff can rely on the presumption to satisfy the element, and then it's really up to the defendant to offer some kind of contrary evidence if there is any contrary evidence. Now, that presumption does not apply to items that are purchased used. You go to a church rummage sale and you purchase a lawnmower. You take it home and there's a defect. Now, this lawnmower may have been used or misused or abused by the previous owner in many different ways. If that lawnmower gives you issues, hurts you, it is on you to show that it is in the same condition as it was when it left the manufacturer's hands if you go to sue the manufacturer. This takes me to the last element. The plaintiff must show that at the time of injury, he was making a foreseeable use of the product. Plaintiff has to be making a foreseeable use of the product at the time of injury. Now, the examiners are very fond of this. And the reason is they think that they can trick you. They think that there is a good little sort of source of confusion here. Here's what they're going to play with. A foreseeable use is not necessarily an appropriate or proper use. Many misuses, many inappropriate uses are nonetheless entirely foreseeable. So do not think that the test is whether the product is being misused. That's incorrect. The test is whether the use is foreseeable. Pete needs something from a high shelf in his home. To get it, he stands up on a chair, and then the chair collapses. It can't support his weight. He brings a claim against the chair manufacturer. What kind of defect? Manufacturing defect. He says it's the 1 in a million bad chair that can't support my weight. They come back at him and they say, wait a second. You were not using the chair in a correct manner. Chairs should not be used as step ladders. They are meant as seating only. Your reaction to that should be, that's irrelevant. The question is whether it is foreseeable that people will stand up on chairs. And I'm going to go yes on foreseeability because everyone does it. I would venture to say, I've never met a person who, if you get them in a candid moment, they would say, yeah, of course, I stand up on a chair. Well, I'm not going to go to the closet and get a step ladder. It's a pain. I'll just stand up on the chair. So the test is foreseeable use, not proper use. And those are our four elements. And let me just say about foreseeable use, there are people who are wacky, and there are people who can use products in unforeseeable ways, right? And so if you take your lawnmower and decide to try to give yourself a haircut with it, that's an unforeseeable use, and there'll be no liability. But for the most part, the questions don't go to that level of absurdity. Okay? So, ready to practice? Ready for a micro essay? Let me give you a question. Here's the deal. Delta makes toasters. They're a manufacturing company, an electronics company, and they sell them to retailers. They go sell direct to retailers, usually not supermarkets, department stores, for distribution to consumers. Pamela bought a Delta brand toaster from Super Deal, a local electronics store. And when she got home, she plugged it in and she got a severe shock. So she sues Delta and she brings her claim as a strict liability claim. At trial, she offers evidence of her injury, and the defendant offers evidence that the specific toaster that Pamela bought had been knocked off of a high shelf by an employee at the Super Deal electronics store, and then he sheepishly, in his embarrassment, placed it back on the shelf. Defendant also offers evidence that an examination of the toaster showed that some safety circuits were disconnected, and an expert witness testified that that would likely be caused by the toaster having fallen from a high distance. If all of this evidence is admissible and the case is sent to the jury, will Pamela succeed in her strict liability claim against Delta Manufacturing? Yes or no? And if yes, why? And if no, why not? And remember, you don't have to write eloquent sentences. You can write 3 or 4 words that just capture it. But the answer is she will not succeed. She will not succeed because this product has been altered since it left Delta's control. Normally, she would have been able to rely on the presumption that it hasn't been altered. But here, the defendant rebutted the presumption with extensive evidence that it had been dropped by the retailer, that the dropping by the retailer caused damage, and that damage was directly traceable to the nature of the injury because it involved the safety circuits. That evidence rebuts the presumption, and in effect, because this defect was introduced after it left their hands, they're not responsible. Let me say one further word about the problem that we just worked, and I want you to embrace this idea. If we held Delta liable on the facts of this question, we would have turned Delta into an insurance company. they're strictly liable, but they're only strictly liable for things that happen on their watch. It's not like we put a toaster into commerce and whatever happens to the toaster, we're going to pay for. This toaster was altered, and that's why they're off the hook. Okay? So, we are now done with the strict liability torts. We should mention a word about defenses, but when I say a word, I am almost being exactly literal. All three of the strict liability torts only have available as a defense one concept, and it is the same concept as comparative negligence. The only distinction is that we give it a different name. In the realm of strict liability, we refer to this doctrine as comparative responsibility. But otherwise, it's exactly the same. If the defendant can prove that the plaintiff, in any strict liability case, was careless, was foolish, did not take proper effort to protect his own safety, was arrogant, was cocky, confronted a known risk, the jury will assign some percentage of responsibility to the plaintiff, and the plaintiff's recovery will be reduced. Your next door neighbor has a tiger. He keeps the tiger in a cage in the backyard. You go next door and you start jabbing the tiger with a stick. The tiger mauls you. The tiger puts his paw out, and just as your hand is inside the cage, he mauls your hand. Serious injury to your hand. Well, yeah, strict liability for keeping a tiger, but you're going to be charged with a very high percentage of the fault. You were taunting the animal. You buy a toaster, you plug it in, it begins emitting a shower of sparks, but hell-bent on having a piece of toast, you decide to use it anyway. Yes, strict liability, manufacturing defect, 1 in a million, bad toaster, but you're a moron. Why are you using a toaster if it's giving off sparks? Stay away from that thing. It's obviously dangerous. So that concludes our discussion of strict liability, and that is the end of, to use Barbary talk, that is the end of that module. Excuse me. And it takes us now to what is the smallest module, the standalone cause of action for the tort of nuisance. Nuisance is not going to be heavily tested. That's why it is a small module. We probably will see one question a year or one question and administration on the MBE, on the MBE, on the multi-state bar exam. It's really a relatively straightforward idea. Nuisance is a tort that involves real estate. It's a tort that involves property. And it is defined as the unreasonable interference with plaintiff's ability to use and enjoy property. Unreasonable interference with plaintiff's ability to use and enjoy property. Now, when I say unreasonable, I don't mean that the defendant is necessarily acting unreasonably. I mean the amount of interference is unreasonable. In English, it means that you're doing something that makes a nearby landowner miserable. You've rendered their condition intolerable. Many, but not all, nuisance cases involve inconsistent land use. Just the unfortunate juxtaposition of two usually commercial enterprises, but sometimes a business and a residence, that shouldn't ever have been near each other. The bar examiners like that kind of fact pattern, the inconsistent land use pattern. The iconic example, which they don't give because it's too commonly used in law school teaching, is the smoke belching factory next to the sanitarium for people suffering from asthma. Obviously, you don't want those co-located, and with all the smoke coming next door, it really makes it difficult to run that sanitarium. So the bar examiners have just riffed on that. Here are two real fact patterns that they gave. One year, they said that there was a recording studio for a heavy metal band located next to a recovery facility for people who had nervous breakdowns. Okay, mildly amusing. The next one, they said there was a plant nursery that sold cow manure in bulk as fertilizer next door to a French restaurant with an outdoor cafe. Okay, so you can see how these businesses should not be next door to each other. Obviously, you can also have a nuisance that doesn't involve inconsistent land uses. You can have a nuisance that involves spite or inconsideration. If you deliberately shine bright lights onto your neighbor's property, your neighbor may have a cause of action against you for nuisance. You're being malicious, and you can't ever go to sleep because these bright lights are so bright that even with drapes or curtains, your house is still lit up really light. Your neighbor is inconsiderate, throws loud parties till all hours of the night or day. That could be a nuisance. Your neighbor is running some kind of illicit operation, basically a drug supermarket next door. There are strange people coming and going, cars parked on the street, weird noises, fights, occasional sounds of gunshot. That could also be a nuisance. The key question is a balancing of the interests. The defendant is entitled to use his land as he wishes, at least if it's a lawful purpose. Not so much as a crack house, but you're entitled to use your land in a lawful way. If you want to have a recording studio for a heavy metal band, and that's within the zoning laws, you're entitled to do that. But your neighbor should be free from misery. Your neighbor should not be subjected to such an imposition that his property becomes worthless and he has to vacate it. If you're going to make the parcel next door essentially uninhabitable, you should buy the parcel next door. So what do you do when you get a nuisance question on the multi-state bar exam? You look for the choice that embodies the legal rule. Look for a choice that says plaintiff will win if defendant's conduct interfered with the ability to use and enjoy the property to an unreasonable degree. Look for the choice that says plaintiff will win if the balance of interest tips in plaintiff's favor. Understand that we are all obligated to put up with minor inconveniences. Those don't rise to the level of a nuisance. If your next door neighbor likes to get up and mow his lawn first thing Sunday morning at 8 a.m., and you like to sleep in Sundays, that's too bad. That's not enough to rise to the level of a nuisance. If you live across the street or down the block from a church and they ring church bells, and the church bells annoy you because you work from home and they disturb your concentration, too bad. It's got to be something that makes your life intolerable. Okay? So that's what we have in the realm of nuisance. Goodbye to that teeny module. And we come to our very last cluster of topics, a trio of miscellaneous considerations. The most important of these is vicarious liability. As you know, it is sometimes possible to hold not just the direct tortfeasor liable, but a secondary party liable as well. That secondary party is almost always going to be liable because of a relationship with the primary tortfeasor. Vicarious liability is predicated on a relationship. I want to tell you about 4 relationships. The first 2 are important. The second 2, very much less important, less likely to show up on the test. Number 1, employer-employee. If an employee goes out and commits a tort, the employer will be liable as well under a vicarious liability theory if the tort was committed, quote, within the scope of employment. Employer vicariously liable if tort is within the scope of employment. Scope of employment has led to a large amount of litigation. There is a large body of case law interpreting what scope of employment means. The bar examiners, with respect to torts questioning on a multi-state exam, they're not expecting you to know that body of case law, and that's good news. Where they have tested on it, I think the most common example of what they have tested on is whether or not an intentional tort is within the scope of employment. I mean, the easy example is you have a delivery person. You run a business, you have a delivery person, they run a red light. They're out in the panel truck, they're delivering the food or they're delivering the flowers, they run a red light. Yeah, you're vicariously liable for that. But what if you're a supermarket and an employee is stocking cans on a shelf? Customer says to the employee, "Excuse me, where do you keep the pasta products?" And the employee turns around and kicks the customer in the groin. Is the supermarket liable for that? The usual answer is no. Intentional torts are outside the scope of employment. But it's not an absolute rule. There are circumstances where these intentional torts come back into the scope of employment. Number one, if the job involves a use of force, then misusing the force is within the scope of employment. Jobs that involve use of force: store security guards, nightclub bouncers. Nightclub bouncer loses his cool. He sees a romantic rival, so he starts wailing on him, punching him, committing batteries. The nightclub will be vicariously liable. Notice what that does. It creates an incentive to hire even-tempered, calm, normal people as your nightclub bouncer. You're authorizing them to use force. If they're the kind of people who are going to lose their cool, we'd rather you didn't hire them. Another example is if the job leads to friction or tension. It's kind of the same logic. Think of the man who repossesses automobiles when you don't make your auto payments. The repo man. If that guy loses his cool and hauls off and punches a customer, the bank or the finance company that employs him, they're going to be vicariously liable. Creates an incentive to hire even-tempered people for that kind of work. And then finally, and slightly differently, any intentional tort that is done to serve the boss's purpose, that will be within the scope of employment. The overzealous store security guard who starts randomly detaining and searching customers to cut down on shoplifting is committing false imprisonment, and that store will be vicariously liable because that was done to serve the store's purpose. So that's my first relationship. That's the biggie, employer-employee. The second relationship is, in a sense, its opposite, and that is hiring party and independent contractor. Hiring party, independent contractor. No vicarious liability there. The general rule is no liability for the torts of an independent contractor, but there is an exception. If you hire an independent contractor to work on your business premises, you will be vicariously liable if that independent contractor hurts a customer, hurts an invitee. Independent contractor working on your property, you will be vicariously liable if they hurt a customer. You hire painters to paint your convenience store. They're going to have to work while the store is open because the store is open 24/7. En route to the job, they run a red light and hit a pedestrian. You're not liable. The painters are independent painting contractors. They're not your employees. No vicarious liability. But once they get to the store, they set up a ladder. They put a can of paint on that shelf. And then they accidentally knock that can off, and that heavy can of paint hits a customer in the head. You're vicariously liable for that. It is sometimes said that you owe a non-delegable duty of care to your customers. You can't delegate the care and wash your hands and be done with it. You remain responsible. Let me tell you about two more relationships that come up, but much less commonly on the exam: automobile owner and automobile driver. The owner of a car is not vicariously liable for the torts of a driver. So if I lend you my car, I am not responsible if you go out and get drunk and drive drunk. If I lend you my car, I am not responsible if you speed. I am not responsible if you run a red light. The exam trick on this one, when they have asked it, is the rule is the other way if I ask you to take my car to do an errand for me. Because if I ask you to take my car to do an errand for me, we're actually in a different relationship. Our relationship now is principal and agent. And you're always vicariously liable for the torts of your agents. The fourth and final relationship, parent and child. And this one is very simple and infrequently appears. No vicarious liability at all. Parents are not liable for the torts of their kids, period, full stop, the end. And people are often surprised about that. They're like, really? So then what happens if you get hurt by a kid? The answer is you sue the kid. And people are like, well, what's the point of that? Well, kids are often covered by insurance. Kids sometimes have their own assets, but the parents are not vicariously liable. So let's go to our next to last subject, penultimate subject, multiple defendant issues. The bar examiners will occasionally ask you to assume that the plaintiff has sued multiple defendants. Let's say 3, Al, Bill, Carl, A, B, C. And the plaintiff will be stipulated in the question to have won the claim and recovered all the money from one of the defendants. Let's say it's a $100,000 judgment, and the plaintiff got that $100K from Al. The question now is, does Al have any rights against co-defendant Bill and co-defendant Carl to get some of that money back? In other words, is there a right of reimbursement? Now, the legal name for this is contribution. So the question is there right of contribution? Having paid the plaintiff in full, can the out-of-pocket defendant look to co-defendants for contribution? And the modern rule is yes, contribution is available, and the amount is set by percentages assigned by the jury. The jury gives each defendant a percentage, and we just follow those numbers, so that if the jury said Al was 10% at fault, and Bill was 30% at fault, and Carl was 60% at fault, then Al gets 30 grand back from Bill and 60 grand back from Carl under the comparative contribution rule. There are, however, 2 scenarios where you can get all your money back, not just a fraction or a percentage. Full reimbursement, and that is called indemnification. The first indemnity scenario arises in a situation where you have been held vicariously liable, and you're the one who paid the plaintiff. A vicariously liable party can get full reimbursement or indemnity from the active tortfeasor. Second, a non-manufacturer, typically a wholesaler or a retailer, can get full indemnification from a manufacturer in a strict liability claim. So if I sue Home Depot and Black & Decker because I bought a defective power tool, and I win against both of them, and I recover all the money from Home Depot, Home Depot can then get indemnity from Black & Decker. They can go to Black & Decker and say, I just paid the plaintiff $100,000, give me that money back. And that has the tendency or the effect of shifting the loss up the chain so that it rests on the shoulders of the manufacturer. So that's what we have in the realm of co-defendants, and it takes me to the very last topic of our time together, and that will be loss of consortium. Whenever a married person is injured and has a valid tort claim, their spouse also gets a separate and independent claim. The uninjured spouse gets a second separate independent claim. The claim is derivative. That means any defenses that could be asserted against the injured plaintiff's spouse can also be asserted against the uninjured consortium spouse. So if there's an argument of consent, you could raise that against the consortium party. If there's an argument of comparative negligence, you could raise that against the consortium party. The question is, why do we even have this claim? What is the point of giving the spouse a remedy? It's to allow recovery of three types of damages that would otherwise go uncompensated. The first is loss of household services. The argument is, with my spouse injured, there's nobody to do the dishes. There's nobody to cook the food. There's nobody to mow the lawn. I may even need to hire somebody to do these things. I want some money. You can get money for that. Second, you can recover for loss of society. Loss of society is basically loss of companionship. The argument is, with my spouse injured, I got nobody to talk to. I'm sad. I'm lonely. I want money for that. You get money for that. And then third and finally, loss of sex. The argument is, with my spouse injured, I'm not getting laid. I'm not getting laid and I want some cash. Now, in theory, you're not supposed to use that money to purchase substitute services, but that's actually between you and your spouse, okay? You got to work that out at home. So that's loss of consortium, and that's what I have for you folks in the law of torts. I want to wish you the very best of luck on the exam. It goes without saying. But more importantly than that, I want to wish you the very best of luck on whatever you're planning to do after the exam. The market remains challenging, but I know that you can find something that will get you excited about the practice of law, get you up out of bed every day, get you psyched to do your work, and hopefully make you a ton of cash, all right? So very best to you, and thanks again.